There are nights when a single small decision, to stop or to keep driving, can rewrite everything that comes after. On a rainy night in Seattle, a tired man was driving home. A woman stood alone in the downpour. No phone, no wallet, no ID. And nobody stopped. He stopped. And from that moment, neither of their lives would ever be the same again. Hit the like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay until the very end, because this one is worth every minute. The rain that night wasn't the kind that made Seattle look romantic. It wasn't the soft, cinematic drizzle that collected on coffee shop windows while jazz played somewhere in the background. This was the kind of rain that had been going since 4 in the afternoon and showed no intention of stopping. Heavy, cold, and indifferent. The kind that soaked through a jacket in under 2 minutes and made the whole city smell like wet concrete and exhaust. Mason Brooks had been driving for 22 minutes, and he already felt like he'd been on the road for 2 hours. His daughter Emma sat in the back seat, buckled in, her small sneakers not quite reaching the floor mat. She was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that shifted toward amber in certain light. And right now, those eyes were half closed, her head tilted against the window, watching the streetlights blur past in streaks of orange and white. She hadn't said much since he'd picked her up from Mrs. Callahan's place. Just climbed in, buckled herself, and stared out the window like she was processing something she didn't have words for yet. Mason understood that feeling. He'd been living inside it for the past 2 years. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. He had work again at 6:15 in the morning, the early warehouse shift at Pacific Freight Solutions, followed by a 4-hour window cleaning contract in the afternoon if the weather broke, which it clearly wasn't going to. He'd made $31 in tips driving for a rideshare app the previous weekend and had already spent $17 of it on Emma's school supplies. There was a bill on the kitchen counter he'd been pretending not to see for 4 days. His back had been hurting since Tuesday from lifting cargo containers without proper support gear. And the ibuprofen in the glove compartment was the store brand kind that barely took the edge off. He wasn't complaining. He'd stopped complaining a long time ago. Complaining required energy he didn't have to spare. The radio was off. He usually kept it off when Emma was in the car at night because the news had a way of being exactly the wrong thing to hear at exactly the wrong time. Instead, there was just the sound of the wipers going back and forth, and the low drone of the engine and the rain hammering the roof in waves. He was 3 blocks from their apartment building when he saw her. At first he thought it was a trash bag someone had left at the bus stop, a dark shape hunched at the far end of the bench, motionless in the rain. The bus stop had a shelter technically, but half the roof paneling had blown off in a windstorm the previous month, and the city hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet, so the shelter mostly just funneled the rain sideways instead of blocking it. The woman, because that was what the shape turned out to be, was sitting at the end of the bench that was directly underneath the broken section. She was soaked completely through. Her hair was plastered flat against her face and neck. She had her arms wrapped around herself with that particular tightness that wasn't just about being cold. It was the tightness of someone trying to hold themselves together when everything around them had already come apart. Mason slowed down without consciously deciding to. There were other cars on the street. He watched 2 of them pass without slowing. A third actually sped up slightly, the way people sometimes do when they sense something uncomfortable ahead and want to get past it before they have to think about it. He pulled over. "Daddy?" Emma's voice came from the back seat, alert now, sleep gone. "It's okay, Bug, just give me a second." He put the hazards on. The orange light pulsed across the rain-slicked street, reflected in the puddles collecting in the gutter. He sat there for a moment, engine running, looking at the woman through the passenger window. She hadn't moved. She hadn't looked up at his headlights the way someone would if they were waiting to wave down a taxi or expecting a ride. She was just sitting there, completely still, the way people sit when they've stopped expecting anything good to happen. He turned off the engine, pocketed his keys, and got out into the rain. It hit him immediately. The cold, the force of it. He jogged the few steps to the shelter and ducked under the edge of the intact roof section, which wasn't much. He was already wet by the time he got there. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30. Her clothes were not cheap. He could tell that even soaked through. The fabric of her jacket was something above the ordinary, the kind that held its shape even wet. But the jacket was wrong for this weather. a fashion piece rather than a functional one, and it had clearly done nothing for her in the past however many hours she'd been sitting there. There was a cut on her right hand near the base of her thumb, small but visible. The skin around it was red and abraded, the kind of injury you got from pavement when your palm hit the ground. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and guarded immediately. Not frightened exactly, but wary in the focused way of someone who has recently had a reason to be. "I'm not trying to bother you," he said right away. He kept a distance, made sure he was visible, nothing in his hands. He'd been a big guy since high school, 6'2", broad through the shoulders from years of physical work, and he'd learned a long time ago that his size could read as threatening before he'd said a single word. You look like you've been out here a while. You okay?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at his car with the hazard still blinking, then back at him. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to make it that way. "Okay." He nodded. He didn't move. The rain was soaking through the back of his collar and running down between his shoulder blades. "Is there someone I can call for you? I've got my phone." Something shifted slightly in her expression. "I don't have anyone's number memorized," she said. "Everything was in my phone." "Your phone's gone?" "My phone, my wallet, my ID." She said it flatly, like reading a list. "Someone grabbed my bag about 4 blocks from here. I wasn't paying attention. I've been sitting here trying to figure out what to do." Mason calculated quickly, not out of cynicism, but out of habit. The cut on her hand was consistent with what she was describing. The shock in her stillness was consistent. The disorientation of someone who'd had their entire material life, every number, every card, every form of identification, yanked away in a matter of seconds. "How long have you been sitting here?" She glanced at the sleeve of her jacket where a watch would be, and then seemed to remember it was gone too. "I don't know. A while." "You need to get dry and warm," he said. "That's the immediate problem. Everything else can wait." "I know that." There was a flash of something in her voice, not quite irritation, but close, the reflex of someone not accustomed to being told obvious things. Then it passed. "I just don't know how to solve it right now." He thought about it for about 3 seconds. "There's a diner 2 blocks up. I can buy you something hot. Figure out next steps from there." She looked at him again with that same measuring look. He understood it. A wet stranger pulls over in the rain and offers to buy dinner. That was not an offer that came without risk, and she knew it as well as anyone. "I'm Mason," he said. "I've got my daughter in the car. I'm just a person trying to help." That's it. She was quiet for another moment. Then she looked past him at the car, and she must have been able to see Emma's silhouette through the rain-fogged window, small and watching. "Olivia?" she said finally. "All right, Olivia. You want to get out of the rain?" She stood up from the bench. She was about 5'7", he guessed, and she moved with a careful deliberateness, the way people move when they're cold enough that their muscles aren't responding properly. She tucked her arms in close to her body. Mason pulled off his jacket. It was a dark green waterproof shell he'd had for 3 years, nothing special, worn at the cuffs, and held it out to her. She started to shake her head. "You'll get wet," she said. "I'm already wet," he pointed out. "And it sounds like you've been wet for a lot longer than I have." She hesitated, then took it. They walked back to the car together. He opened the passenger door for her, not as a performance of chivalry, but because it was right there and the rain was still coming down hard, and he was already at that side of the car. She got in. He jogged around to the driver's side and climbed in, and the warmth of the interior closed around them both, and Emma leaned forward from the back seat. "Hi," Emma said. Olivia turned. For a moment, the wariness left her face completely, and something more genuine moved across it instead. "Hi," she said. "What's your name?" "Emma. I'm 7. Who are you?" "I'm Olivia. I'm very wet." Emma considered this seriously. "We're going to the diner," she said, as if this solved everything. "They have hot chocolate with real marshmallows, not the little fake ones." "That sounds perfect," Olivia said, and she almost smiled. Mason pulled back into traffic, the hazards still clicking once before he turned them off. In the rearview mirror, he could see Emma studying their passenger with the frank, unfiltered attention of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was rude. He didn't ask Olivia anything else right then. The diner was 2 blocks, and he'd learned from experience that people who'd just been through something difficult didn't need questions. They needed warmth and a few minutes to stop shaking before anything else could happen. The diner was called Patty's, which had nothing to do with hamburgers. Patty was the owner's grandmother, whose photograph watched over the room from above the cash register in a slightly crooked frame that had been slightly crooked since 1987. It was the kind of place where the menus had laminate worn down at the corners, and the coffee came automatically when you sat down, and the servers remembered what you ordered even when you hadn't been in for a month. The woman at the hostess stand, a heavy-set woman named Deb with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked at Olivia's state for exactly 1 second, and then said, "Table by the heater," without making it into an event. They slid into a booth near the back. The heater above them exhaled warmth down over the table, and Mason watched some of the rigid tension leave Olivia's shoulders in increments, slow and reluctant, like ice melting when it's not quite convinced the cold is done. Emma ordered the hot chocolate. Mason ordered a coffee and the patty melt, not because he was particularly hungry, but because he was absolutely starving and had been since approximately 2 p.m. when he'd eaten half a granola bar over a warehouse loading dock and called it lunch. He looked at Olivia. "Get whatever you want," he said. "I mean it." She looked at the menu. She looked at it the way people sometimes do when they're trying to make sure they're not being too much trouble, cataloging costs rather than preferences. He noticed that, and it sat in him in a small, specific way. "The soup's good," he said. "Tomato or chicken? Either one." She ordered the chicken soup and a grilled cheese, and when it came, she ate like someone who had not eaten in a very long time, with that careful deliberateness of someone trying to maintain dignity while their body was making other demands. Mason didn't watch her. He talked to Emma about her day at school, something about a math worksheet that hadn't gone well, and a disagreement with a friend named Priya that Emma described in the involved, wounded way that 7-year-olds describe minor social catastrophes. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He'd learned that the details mattered to her, that she needed to feel like the math worksheet was a thing worth being upset about, not something to be measured against adult problems and found wanting. After a while, Olivia set down her spoon and looked at them. "Does she always talk that much?" she asked Mason, not unkindly. "Since she could form sentences," he said. "That's good," Olivia said. And she meant it, he could tell. Emma, who had been aware of the adult conversation around her even while conducting her own, looked at Olivia directly. "Where do you live?" "Emma," Mason said. "No, it's okay." Olivia wrapped both hands around her soup bowl. I've been staying at a hotel near the waterfront." "What hotel?" "Emma." "The Meridian," Olivia said. "That's a fancy one," Emma said, with the certainty of someone who had driven past it many times. "It has a fountain out front." "It does," Olivia agreed. "You should call them," Mason said. "The hotel. They'll have your reservation on file, they can verify who you are, help you get in touch with your bank, and get a replacement card issued. That's your most immediate path." He paused. "Do you know the number?" "I can look it up if you let me use your phone." He handed her his phone without hesitation. She dialed. He drank his coffee and listened without meaning to. The conversation on the phone was brief and did not go the way she'd hoped. He could tell from the incremental flattening of her expression. When she handed the phone back, she sat with it for a moment, hands in her lap. "Problem?" he said. "The reservation is under a company name. The night manager says he can't release room access without verifying ID, and corporate policy doesn't allow him to make exceptions, and the person who could authorize an exception doesn't answer after 9 p.m. She said it with a kind of careful evenness that suggested she was managing a much larger reaction. He was very apologetic. "You can stay at our place," Emma said. Mason looked at his daughter. She had said it the way she said most things, simply as a statement of obvious fact, without calculating the implications or the awkwardness or the 100 reasons it was a complicated offer. Olivia looked startled. No, I couldn't." "It's just the sofa," Emma continued, apparently feeling this was a clarification that would resolve the issue. "It's comfortable. I sleep on it sometimes when Daddy and I watch movies, and I fall asleep before the end." Mason looked at Olivia. She was looking at Emma with that expression again, the one that appeared when the wariness dropped for a second and something more unguarded moved in behind it. "I have a sofa," he confirmed, keeping his voice neutral. "You're welcome to it tonight. Get some sleep. In the morning, the bank will be open, you can report the theft, get the hotel situation sorted. You don't have to decide anything tonight except whether you want the sofa or the bus stop." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the diner window, the rain had not let up. Through the glass, they could see it hitting the sidewalk in little bursts, the gutters running fast and dark. "Okay," she said. "Just tonight. Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank the person who swiped your bag. You'd have been fine otherwise." That almost made her laugh. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. The apartment was on the fourth floor of a building on Clement Street that had been built in 1971, and looked it. The elevator worked about 70% of the time. The hallway carpet was the particular shade of brown that suggested it had been installed in a decade with different taste, and the light above 4C buzzed slightly when you walked past it, which Mason had reported to the building manager twice and stopped caring about after the second time. It was not a nice apartment. It was a clean apartment, which was something Mason insisted on because Emma deserved that much, and it was a warm apartment, and the locks on the door were solid. He unlocked the door and they went in. Emma went immediately to her bedroom to change into pajamas, issuing a stream of instructions about where the bathroom was and which shelf in the kitchen had the good crackers, as though she were a hostess who had been anticipating this visit. Mason found a towel, a clean set of sweatpants, and a long-sleeved shirt that was his but would fit Olivia reasonably, and left them outside the bathroom door. He set up the sofa with the good blanket, the heavy fleece one Emma had picked out at Target the previous winter, blue with small white stars, and put a glass of water on the coffee table. When Olivia came out of the bathroom in his sweatpants and the shirt, with the towel around her still damp hair, she looked different. Not because the clothes were better than what she'd been wearing, they clearly weren't, but because the layer of tension that had been holding her rigid in the rain was gone. She looked for the first time like someone who could breathe. She stood in the living room and looked around it. He watched her look. The apartment told a particular kind of story if you knew how to read it. The framed school photo of Emma on the side table, lopsided grin, and a gap where her front left tooth used to be. The stack of library books on the corner of the coffee table, two of them children's picture books, and one of them a mechanical engineering manual with a cracked spine. The tool belt hanging by the door, heavy with use. The small evidence, everywhere, of a man managing his life with two hands and no slack in the line. "This is a nice place," she said, and she said it the way people say things that are true even when they contain a qualification. "It's enough," he said. He made her a cup of tea, the decent kind, the box he kept in the back of the cabinet, and she sat on the sofa with both hands around the mug. Emma came back out in her pajamas, her hair in a ponytail that was slightly off-center, and planted herself next to Olivia on the sofa like they were old friends. "Did Daddy tell you about the time the elevator got stuck with us and Mrs. Pellegrino's cat?" Emma asked. "Emma, she doesn't need to hear that." "What happened?" Olivia asked. "The cat got out of the carrier," Emma said with great satisfaction, "and it climbed on Daddy's head." "It did not climb on my head." "It was on your head, Daddy." He looked at Olivia. "It was briefly on my shoulder." "It was on his head," Emma told Olivia with complete sincerity. "He was very calm about it. He's calm about everything." "That's a useful quality," Olivia said. "Mom used to say it was annoying sometimes," Emma said, "but in a good way." The word landed in the room quietly. Mason didn't flinch, but there was a beat, small, barely perceptible, before he picked up the thread again. "Okay, Bug. Bedtime." "I'm not tired." "You were asleep in the car 20 minutes ago." Emma seemed to consider contesting this and then thought better of it. She looked at Olivia. "Will you be here in the morning?" Olivia glanced at Mason briefly. "I think so." "Yes." Emma nodded as though this were settled. "Okay. Good night, Olivia." "Good night, Emma." Mason walked Emma to her room, helped her get the ponytail elastic out without pulling, turned off the overhead light, and turned on the small nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling. A gift from her grandmother, 2 Christmases back. Emma was asleep before he reached the doorway, with the absolute completeness of small children who fall in like a switch was thrown. He went back to the living room. Olivia was still on the sofa, both hands around the mug, not looking at the television or at her phone because she had no phone to look at. She was just sitting with the silence. He sat in the armchair across from her. "You doing okay?" "I've had better evenings," she said. "That seems accurate." She looked at the wall for a moment, then she looked at him. "Why did you stop?" "Because you were sitting in the rain at 10 o'clock and nobody else was stopping." "That's not a reason," she said. "That's a description." He thought about it. "I don't know," he said. "I saw you and it didn't sit right with me to drive past, so I didn't." He shrugged. It was not an eloquent answer, it was the true one. She seemed to accept that. "Emma mentioned her mother," Olivia said, and then stopped. "You don't have to—" "Car accident," he said. It came out even, not because the evenness was natural, but because he'd said it enough times that the words had worn smooth on the outside. 2 years ago, Emma was 5. He paused. "It was a Tuesday. I was at work. It was a Tuesday, and it was raining, actually. Not this bad. Just regular rain." "I'm sorry," she said. Not the performative sorry. The social reflex sorry. The kind that came from actually registering what he'd said. "Yeah." He looked at the engineering manual on the coffee table. He'd been working through a chapter on hydraulic systems before Emma's school called last week about the math worksheet situation, and the context had never quite come back. She was a good person, better than I am, most ways. "Emma seems pretty good," Olivia said. "That doesn't happen without somebody doing something right." He didn't have a response to that. He just sat with it. Outside, the rain was beginning, just barely beginning, to let up. The hammering on the window glass was getting softer. He could hear, in the gaps, the sound of a car passing on the street below, with a particular hiss that meant the water on the asphalt was starting to thin. "The cut on your hand," he said. "There's a first aid kit under the bathroom sink, second shelf." She looked at her hand. She'd forgotten about it, or been ignoring it. "It's fine. It should be cleaned properly. I cleaned it in the bathroom. Okay?" He let it go. They sat for another minute in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which was unusual for two people who had been strangers an hour ago. He wasn't sure why it wasn't uncomfortable. Maybe it was just that they were both too tired for the performance of conversation. The part where you show someone who you are, instead of just being it. "I'll get out of your hair first thing in the morning," she said. "I just need to get to a branch of my bank when it opens, and then I can sort out the rest." "No rush," he said. And then, because it was almost midnight and he had a 6:15 alarm, and she looked like she hadn't slept properly in longer than one night. "You should sleep." "Yeah," she set down the mug. "Mason." "Yeah." "Thank you. I know you said don't, but—" She stopped. "Thank you." He nodded once. "The blanket's warm," he said. "The sofa's not bad. I'll try to keep it quiet in the morning." He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain slow down and eventually stop, leaving the city in that particular post-rain silence that was not quite quiet. Still water dripping from gutters, tires on wet pavement, the building's heating system ticking over. He thought about the $31 in tip money. He thought about the bill on the counter. He thought about Emma's face when she'd said Olivia could stay, simple and certain. The way she approached most things that seemed obvious to her. He thought about his wife, briefly, because Tuesdays in rain always made him do that. He let the thought exist without fighting it. He fell asleep. In the living room, under the blue blanket with the small white stars, Olivia Sterling, who had not given her last name, who had given almost nothing except the first one, lay on the sofa and stared at the ceiling of a small apartment belonging to a man she did not know, in a city where she was supposed to be invisible, in a life that was considerably more complicated than a single rainy bus stop suggested. She had been in Seattle for 4 days. She had not been there for the waterfront views or the coffee or the famous fish market. She had been there because 6 months ago, an anonymous message had arrived in an encrypted channel that only 3 people in the world knew existed. One of them was her chief of operations, one of them was her head of security, and one of them was her. The message had contained a single line. The containers aren't moving where they say they are. She had spent 4 days trying to verify that claim without alerting anyone inside her own company. She had spent 4 days being careful. And then she'd walked 2 blocks from her hotel to get air at 9 p.m., and someone had materialized out of a doorway so fast she hadn't even processed what was happening until her bag was gone, and she was on her hands and knees on the wet pavement with a cut on her palm and the sound of running footsteps already fading. Random mugging. Or maybe not. She didn't know yet. She knew 3 things. She knew the company bearing her name. Sterling Logistics, $12 billion in annual revenue, operations across 41 countries, was being used for something that had nothing to do with logistics. She knew that whatever it was had been running for at least 2 years, possibly 3. And she knew that someone inside her organization, someone close enough to access the routing systems, was at the center of it. She knew one more thing, which she hadn't expected to know. She knew that there was a man in the next room who had stopped his car in the rain for a stranger and hadn't asked for anything in return, who had given her his jacket, who'd bought her soup, who'd let her into his home with a second-hand ease that was not naivety. She'd watched him carefully enough to be sure of that, but something else, something she didn't quite have the word for, who'd told her about his wife dying on a Tuesday in the rain in 2 sentences, with no performance of grief and no demand for acknowledgement, just the plain fact of it. She thought about Emma saying he's calm about everything with absolute confidence, like this was the most solid thing she knew about the world. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. The apartment breathed around her. The tick of the heating, the distant sound of the city, the absolute stillness from behind the door where a man who had to be up in 6 hours was already asleep because he couldn't afford to lie awake. Tomorrow she would go to the bank. Tomorrow she would figure out what came next. Tonight she was just someone in a stranger's living room, under a blanket with stars on it, with a cut on her hand that had been cleaned properly, whether she'd admitted it or not. In the first place in 4 days that had felt, against all reason, like something approaching safe. She closed her eyes. The city moved on outside, indifferent and continuous, as it always did. And in the morning, everything would be different. Not because anything had been solved, but because things that have been set in motion do not stop simply because the people caught in them need a night to rest. The morning would come. And it did. Mason's alarm went off at 6:07 in the morning, 8 minutes before it was supposed to, because he'd set 2 alarms, the phone alarm and the small travel clock on the nightstand, and the travel clock ran fast. He lay still for a moment in that particular state of not quite awake that felt like trying to read through frosted glass. Then he turned off both alarms before the second one could fire, because Emma needed every extra minute of sleep she could get, and he'd gotten good over the past 2 years at moving through the apartment quietly. He showered fast with the water temperature 1 degree below comfortable, the way he always did, a habit from the Navy that had nothing to do with discipline anymore, and everything to do with the fact that the building's hot water ran thin past 7 a.m. He dressed in the dark of his bedroom, jeans and a long-sleeved work shirt and the steel-toed boots he kept by the bedroom door. He ran his hand across his jaw and decided the stubble was on the acceptable side of the line and left it. When he came out into the living room, Olivia was already awake. She was sitting on the sofa with the folded blanket beside her, wearing yesterday's jacket over his sweatpants, her dark hair pulled back from her face, and she was staring at the wall with the focused blankness of someone who had not really slept at all. He stopped in the doorway. "I thought you'd still be out," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'm an early riser," she said. Then after a pause, "I don't sleep great in new places." He went to the kitchen and started the coffee without asking if she wanted any because it was 6 in the morning and that was not a question that required asking. The kitchen was narrow, galley style, barely enough room for 2 people to stand side by side. And he worked around it efficiently, the movements automatic. Filters, grounds, water. The machine was an older model that was loud when it got going, and he angled it slightly away from the wall to muffle it, another small accommodation he'd built into his routine without noticing. "Bank opens at 9, he said, not looking at her. "You've got time." "I know." He heard her get up from the sofa and move toward the kitchen doorway. He felt her presence behind him without turning around, the way you feel someone enter a room even when you're not looking. "I was thinking," she said. "Okay. There might be a problem with the bank." He turned then. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, one shoulder leaned against the frame, her arms crossed. The expression on her face was the one he'd seen the night before when she was on the phone with the hotel. That careful, managed evenness over something more complicated underneath. "What kind of problem?" he said. "The account I need to access. It's not a standard personal account. It's structured in a way that requires verification through two separate channels. Usually that's my phone and a secondary ID." She paused. "I don't have either of those right now." "What do you do have?" "My face," she said flatly, "and my social security number and two passwords that exist only in my head. Whether that's enough to satisfy the bank's fraud protocol without the additional verification is something I genuinely don't know until I try." The coffee maker finished its cycle. He poured 2 cups, handed her one, and leaned against the counter. He looked at her over the rim of his mug while he drank. She was not what he would have called fragile. There was nothing fragile in the way she held herself, or the way she'd answered his questions the night before. But there was something stripped down about her this morning, like a layer had been removed overnight and she hadn't quite decided yet what to put in its place. "Where are you from?" he asked. Not because it was relevant, but because he was curious and it was 6 a.m. and the question came naturally. She looked at him like she was trying to determine if the question was loaded. "Originally, Connecticut, Greenwich." He nodded once. That explained the jacket. Greenwich explained a lot of things, actually, though he didn't say that. "You?" she said. "Mobile, Alabama. Moved to Seattle when I got out of the Navy." He paused. "That was 11 years ago. Haven't really thought of Alabama as home since." "What did you do in the Navy?" "Marine mechanical systems. I was responsible for diesel propulsion maintenance on a supply vessel for about 6 years. He said it the same way he said most things about himself. Plainly, without inflation, the way you describe something factual. "After that, I got a civilian engineering certificate. Worked for a company that serviced commercial port equipment. That's how I ended up here. The job ended, Seattle didn't." She wrapped both hands around the mug the same way she had with the tea the night before. A specific, habitual gesture, he noticed. "How long have you been doing the warehouse work?" 18 months. The engineering work dried up. There were layoffs." He didn't elaborate. He didn't see the point in elaborating. Layoffs happened. People adjusted. "I pick up other contracts when I can. Window cleaning, equipment repair for a couple of local businesses. I fixed a boat engine for a guy last month and he paid me in cash and a box of salmon, which, honestly, worked out better than it sounds." That almost got a smile again. She was close, he thought. Whatever was holding it back was something internal, something she was managing consciously. Emma's door opened and Emma emerged, hair flattened on one side, pajamas wrinkled, looking like someone who had been physically removed from sleep against her will. She stood in the hallway for a moment, processing the fact that Olivia was still there, and then her face registered something that was not quite relief, but was in that neighborhood. "You stayed," Emma said. "I stayed," Olivia said. "Do you want cereal? We have the kind with the colored pieces and the kind that tastes like cardboard. Daddy only buys the cardboard kind for himself, but the good kind is in the cabinet above the microwave." Emma: "It's true. The cardboard kind has more fiber," Mason said, which was a thing he'd said before and which Emma treated with the same respect she always gave it. "I would love the colored piece kind," Olivia said. They ate breakfast at the small kitchen table, the 3 of them, which was a configuration the table had not seen in 2 years. The table was meant for 4, but the 4th chair had migrated to the corner of Emma's room to hold stuffed animals and had not been reclaimed. Mason thought about getting it briefly, and then decided it would make too much of the moment. So he stood at the counter with his coffee and his cardboard cereal and let Emma monopolize Olivia's attention with the story of the math worksheet. Olivia listened the same way she'd listened the night before, with genuine attention, the kind you couldn't convincingly fake to a 7-year-old who could always tell the difference. She asked questions at the right places. She didn't talk down or oversimplify. She treated Emma's account of the math worksheet incident with exactly the seriousness it deserved, which was the same seriousness you'd give a thing that mattered to a person you were talking to, regardless of scale. Mason watched this and noted it and said nothing about it. He dropped Emma at Mrs. Callahan's on his way to the warehouse. Emma hugged him around the middle the way she always did, her arms barely reaching, her face pressed into his side, and then she looked up at him. "Is Olivia going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said. "She just needs to sort some things out. She'll be fine." Emma seemed to evaluate this. "She seems like she's worried about something besides getting robbed," she said. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old and sharp as a tack, always had been. "Get inside, Bug. Mrs. Callahan's waiting." He drove to the warehouse with the radio still off. The morning was clear after the night's rain. One of those bright, washed-out Seattle mornings that came after a hard rain and made everything look slightly more real than usual, the colors more saturated, the lines more defined. The water on the streets was almost gone, just the gutters still running. He thought about what Olivia had said about the bank account, the 2-channel verification, the phone and ID she didn't have. He thought about the hotel, the corporate reservation. He thought about the jacket, the quality of it, the specific cut. He thought about the way she'd said Greenwich without any kind of performance, neither apologetic nor proud, just stating a fact. And he thought about the focused, directed quality of her attention when she'd looked at him, like someone who was accustomed to extracting information quickly and retaining it. He'd met people like that before. Not many, but a few. They had a particular texture to them, a particular way of organizing a room without appearing to, a way of positioning themselves in conversations so they were always slightly more informed than their counterpart expected. He didn't know what to make of it yet. He filed it and went to work. The morning at the warehouse was standard: inventory transfer, machinery checks, 2 loading dock issues that took longer to resolve than they should have because one of the forklifts was running with a hydraulic calibration problem that the maintenance team had flagged 3 weeks ago and nobody had addressed. Mason addressed it in his lunch break because watching equipment run wrong was something he could not tolerate on a personal level. The dock supervisor told him he didn't have to do that. Mason said he knew and kept working. He got back to the apartment at 4:30 p.m., still in his work clothes, still carrying the smell of the warehouse. He expected to find the place empty. Olivia would have gone to the bank, sorted herself, returned to the hotel, moved on. The sofa would be back to normal and Emma would have an interesting story to tell for a few weeks, and that would be the end of it. Instead, he opened the door and found Olivia sitting at his kitchen table with his mechanical engineering manual open in front of her and a look on her face that he could not immediately categorize. She looked up when he came in. "Bank was a problem," she said. He set down his keys. "What kind?" "The kind where the fraud prevention system flagged the access attempt without the secondary verification, put a 72-hour hold on all account access, and requires me to appear in person at a branch I've previously used, which is in Chicago, to override it." He stared at her for a moment. "You're from a branch in Chicago." "My company is headquartered in Chicago, yes." "So you're stuck here for 72 hours?" "At minimum." She closed the engineering manual and looked at him directly. "I can pay you back for everything once I resolve this. The food, the sofa, whatever you need." "I don't need anything," he said. "Mason, you can stay," he said. "It's a sofa. It's not a hardship." She pressed her lips together. He could see she didn't like accepting help she couldn't immediately balance, the kind of person who ran their debts in their head and found the imbalance uncomfortable. "I can help with things," she said finally, "while I'm here, whatever needs doing." He thought about the mountain of laundry he'd been putting off. He thought about Emma's library books, which were 4 days overdue. He thought about the invoice for the window cleaning job he hadn't sent yet because he kept forgetting. "I'll think of something," he said. He showered and changed and picked up Emma, and when they got back, Olivia had made dinner. This was unexpected and also slightly alarming because he couldn't tell if she knew how to cook or had just decided to try, and the results of those 2 things were not interchangeable. But the kitchen smelled like pasta and something with garlic, and when he looked in the pot, it was actually a proper meal. Nothing complicated, just spaghetti with a sauce that had real vegetables in it and actual seasoning. And Emma walked in, stopped, and said, "It smells like before," in a voice that was entirely unself-conscious, and Mason had to look at a fixed point on the opposite wall for a moment before he could respond. "Before when?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "Before, when you used to cook more." Emma examined the pot with professional interest. You always just do the box stuff now. The box stuff is efficient, he said. It tastes like the box, Emma said, and went to wash her hands without further commentary. He looked at Olivia. She was watching him with a careful expression. I shouldn't have, she started. It's fine, he said. It smells good. It did smell good. And it tasted good, which he hadn't expected, and he told her so, and she said she'd learned to cook in the year after business school when she'd been living in a studio apartment in Boston with a budget that didn't accommodate restaurants and a stubborn refusal to admit that cooking was harder than it looked. It's not harder than it looks, Emma said. It absolutely is, Olivia said. I can make scrambled eggs. So can I. That doesn't count. Why not? Because the standard is higher than scrambled eggs. Otherwise, my 7-year-old cousin would be a chef. You have a 7-year-old cousin? Olivia stopped. She'd said it automatically, pulled from some store of ordinary information that she hadn't planned to offer. Had, she said, and then corrected it. She's 11 now. I haven't seen her in a while. Why not? Emma, Mason said. It's a normal question, Emma said. Olivia looked at her plate for a moment. Because I work a lot, she said, and I'm not always good at making time for things that should be priorities. She said it plainly, without softening it, and Emma accepted this with the seriousness she gave most honest answers. That happens, Emma said. Mrs. Callahan says the same thing about her son. He lives in Portland. Portland's not that far, Olivia said. That's what Mrs. Callahan says too, Emma agreed. They did the dishes together, the three of them, because Emma insisted on helping in a way that slowed the process considerably, but which Mason had learned not to argue with. Olivia washed, Mason dried. Emma handed things up from the lower rack with an air of critical supervision. It was an ordinary evening in an apartment that had become accustomed to ordinary evenings, and Mason moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who had rebuilt a routine from scratch and held on to it, because routine was the thing that kept the days from slipping sideways. But something about having Olivia in the room changed the texture of it slightly, not in a disruptive way, but in the way that a different frequency of sound changes the quality of silence when it stops. He was aware of her presence in a way he wasn't usually aware of other people's. He didn't examine this. He just filed it, the same way he'd filed the jacket and the bank account and the Greenwich. Emma went to bed at the usual time with the usual negotiation. 15 more minutes, then 10, then a glass of water, then the nightlight checked twice. When Mason came back to the living room, Olivia was standing at the window, looking out at the street below. Can I ask you something? She said, not turning around. Sure. You said you worked on port equipment, commercial shipping infrastructure. Yeah. How well do you know the Seattle port operations? The container terminal specifically? He considered the question. It was oddly specific. Pretty well. I did maintenance contracts out there for about 8 months before the company folded. Why? She turned from the window. Her expression had changed. The careful social layer was still there, but underneath it was something sharper and more directed, the quality he'd noticed before. I want to show you something, she said, and I need you to tell me if I'm reading it wrong. She went to her jacket, still hanging by the door, dried out, but still telling the story of last night in its crumpled lapels. And from an interior pocket she produced a folded piece of paper. It was damp at the edges and the fold lines were soft from the rain, but it was legible. She unfolded it carefully on the coffee table. He sat down across from it. He looked. It was a printout of a shipping manifest, or rather, a section of one. The columns dense with container IDs, port codes, timestamps, vessel designations. He recognized the format. He'd read a lot of them. Where did you get this? He asked. I printed it at the hotel business center before my things were taken, she said, which is why I still have it. He looked at her. Okay. She sat down on the other end of the coffee table from the paper, leaning forward, elbows on knees. Read the transit timestamps for containers marked SL7 through SL12 in the third column. He read them. He read them again. Then he picked up the paper and looked at it more carefully, because what he was seeing didn't make sense at first pass, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't misreading the format. He set the paper back down. These containers are logged as arriving in Portland on the 14th, he said. Yes. But they're also logged as being scanned at the Tacoma terminal on the 15th. Yes. That's not a routing error, he said. Tacoma to Portland is south to north. You can't log an arrival in Portland and then show up in Tacoma the next day unless something in the system is being manually entered in the wrong sequence. He paused. Or unless the Portland arrival log is fabricated. That's what I think, she said. He put the paper down. He looked at her, and this time the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the night before moved toward the front. Who are you? He said. Not your name. Who are you? She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was a decision, not an absence of something to say. My name is Olivia Sterling, she said. Sterling Logistics. I'm the founder and CEO. The company was not obscure. Sterling Logistics had been in the financial news regularly for the past 5 years. One of the fastest growing logistics companies in the country, operations across multiple continents, a valuation that had more zeros in it than most people ever dealt with in the context of a single sentence. He'd heard the name. He'd seen it on the sides of shipping containers. He had almost certainly, at some point in his 8 months at the port, touched cargo that moved through her company's network. He sat with this information for a moment. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay? I believe you, he said. The jacket made sense. The bank account structure made sense. The manifest makes sense now. He picked up the paper again and looked at it. SL Sterling Logistics. Yes, someone in your company is falsifying cargo movement records. That's what the manifest suggests. Why are you here in Seattle, specifically? I received an anonymous report 6 months ago, specific to the Seattle-Tacoma Port Corridor. Someone inside my company knew something and they were too afraid to go through official channels. She paused. Given what I know now about who's behind this, I understand why. Who's behind it? She shook her head slightly. Not a refusal, but a signal that that part of the answer was more complicated than she could compress right now. Someone with access to the routing system at an administrative level, which narrows it to about 15 people inside the company. But with the scale of what I'm finding, she gestured at the manifest. It's not just system access. There's money moving. There's a lot of money moving. And you came here yourself, without your security team, I'm guessing. If I'd brought my security team, whoever is behind this would know I was looking within 12 hours. My security reports to the COO. She paused. Who is on the list of 15? Mason set down the paper. He looked at the wall. He thought about the containers he'd worked around for 8 months. The massive metal boxes that moved through the port in their hundreds every day, each one logged and tracked and routed through a system that was supposed to be airtight. He thought about the SL-7 arriving in Portland before it showed up in Tacoma. He thought about what that meant in terms of cargo that could be moved and logged somewhere it wasn't and explained away as a system entry error. The missing containers, he said slowly. If the Portland arrival is fabricated, then the cargo inside them was somewhere else entirely, while the system showed them in transit. He paused. You could move a lot through that gap, depending on what you were trying to move. Yes, Olivia said. How long has this been running? At least 2 years based on what I can verify. Possibly 3. He was quiet. She was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did at 10 p.m. Not quiet, never quite quiet, but reduced. The daytime urgency dialed back to a low hum. I can't go back to the hotel, she said. After last night, if my bag was taken deliberately, if someone is tracking me, the hotel is the first place they'd look. He thought about this. He thought about a woman who ran a $12 billion company sitting on a bus stop bench in the rain because she'd been trying to do something difficult and alone. He thought about the cut on her hand. He thought about Emma asking if Olivia was worried about something besides getting robbed. The sofa's still there, he said. She looked at him steadily. This is not a small thing I'm asking. You're not asking, he said. I'm offering. There's a difference. She pressed her lips together again in that way she had. Why? He thought about the answer. He gave her the same kind of answer he'd given when she asked why he'd stopped at the bus stop. Not the clean version, just the true one. "Because you showed me a shipping manifest at 10 o'clock at night, and I want to know how it ends," he said. That got a real reaction. Not quite a laugh, but the first true break in the managed evenness, a small surprised movement at the corner of her mouth that was entirely unperformed and lasted only a second before she pulled it back. But it happened. He saw it. "Also," he said, because she deserved the full answer, "whoever grabbed your bag in the rain while you were walking alone, I don't like the way that reads, and I like the idea of you in a hotel by yourself even less." He paused. "You can tell me that's not my business." "It's not your business," she said, but she said it without force, more like completing the expected line than meaning it. "Yeah," he said. "So, sofa." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," she said. It was a warning, a real one, not performed. "I know it involves falsified shipping manifests and someone with access to a logistics network worth about $12 billion, he said, "and I know a little bit about how port routing systems work." He shrugged. "Maybe that's useful. Maybe not." Outside, somewhere on the street below, a car went past slowly, more slowly than traffic warranted. Mason registered this in the peripheral way he'd learned in the Navy to register things that didn't quite fit. He didn't look immediately. He listened. The car kept moving and turned at the corner, and its engine note faded. Probably nothing. But Olivia had gone still in the way of someone who had heard it too. Their eyes met briefly. Neither of them said anything about it. "I'll set up the sofa," he said. She nodded. She refolded the manifest along its worn lines and slipped it back into her jacket pocket. She did it carefully, with the attention you give to something that is the only copy of an important thing. Later, when the apartment was dark and quiet, Mason lay in his room and stared at the ceiling again. His mind was running in the systematic way it ran when he was working a technical problem. Methodical, linear, building from what he knew toward what he didn't. The timestamps on the manifest. The gap in the system. The scale of what you could hide inside that gap. Whoever had built this had needed three things: administrative access to the routing system, enough operational knowledge to make the false records look plausible, and enough time for the pattern to become routine. 2 years, maybe 3, right under everyone's nose. He thought about the slow car on the street outside. He thought about Emma asking if Olivia was worried about something besides getting robbed. He thought about his daughter sleeping 12 feet away, entirely unbothered by the fact that a billionaire was on the sofa in the living room because she'd known, with the certainty of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to distrust her own instincts, that it was the right thing to do. He fell asleep thinking about port routing timestamps and woke up the next morning with a specific question already formed in his head, the way solutions sometimes surfaced from whatever his brain did while he was unconscious. He needed to see more manifests, not because he'd decided anything, not because he'd committed to something that would complicate his life considerably if he thought it through, but because the pattern was there in that single page. And if the pattern was there, the rest of it was somewhere too, and he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a mechanical problem half-assembled. He got up quietly in the early gray light and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for Olivia to wake up. She appeared 20 minutes later with her hair loose and her eyes carrying the particular flatness of someone who had slept in pieces. She stopped when she saw him sitting there with a mug in both hands. "I need to see the other manifests," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "There aren't any others. That's the only page I printed." "Then we need to get them," he said. "Is there a way to access your company's logistics database from outside the building?" "There's a remote access portal," she said slowly, "but it's monitored. If I log in from an unregistered location, it'll flag the access in the system." "Who monitors the system flags?" She paused. The answer moved across her expression before she said it. "The COO. Your COO who's on your list of 15, he said. "Yes." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He thought about it. "There's another way," he said finally. "The manifests aren't just in your company's system. Port terminal records are logged independently through the federal system. It's public access up to a certain classification level. I know the terminal interface from my contract work, I used to pull records to cross-reference maintenance schedules. He paused. I can access the public-facing logs without touching your company's system at all. If the discrepancies show up there too, we have something that exists independently of any database your COO can reach. Olivia was very still. You can do that. I've done it before. Different purpose, same access. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the managed evenness, not the wary assessment, but something more direct and unguarded. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, like the way people look when they realize the thing they needed was already in the room. Mason, she said. Yeah. I need to tell you something properly. She said it carefully, like she was measuring each word. This isn't just fraud. I think someone is using Sterling Logistics to move things through the port corridor that have nothing to do with commercial shipping. The scale of the false logging, the specific container classifications involved, I think there are people inside my company who have sold access to criminal networks. And I think when they realize I'm close to finding out, they're going to try to stop me. He held her gaze. You think last night was them? I think it's possible. I don't know for certain. But you think so? Yes, she said. I think so. He set down his mug. He thought about the slow car. He thought about the logistics of what she was describing. Not the abstract danger of it, but the specific mechanics, the same way he approached any problem. What were the moving parts? What were the constraints? What was the sequence of actions that led from where they were to a point where whatever was happening inside Sterling Logistics was visible to someone who could actually act on it? Okay, he said. Okay, what? We pull the federal terminal records today. Then we see what we have. He stood up. But first you should eat something, and I need to call in to the warehouse. She stared at him. That's it? I just told you that whoever robbed me might be connected to organized criminal activity, and you said, okay, and now you want breakfast? I want coffee, he clarified. You want breakfast, and yes, because standing in the kitchen deciding whether to panic about it doesn't change the terminal records. She opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at him with that expression again. The one that wasn't quite named, the one that kept appearing in the gaps between the managed parts of her face. You're a very strange person, she said. I've heard that, he said, and went to start the eggs. The Federal Terminal database was not pretty. It was the kind of government interface that had been designed in the early 2000s by someone who prioritized function over everything else, then updated twice in 15 years by contractors who hadn't talked to each other, resulting in something that looked like 3 different websites stapled together and required knowing the specific sequence of drop-down menus to navigate without getting lost in the wrong subsection. Mason knew the sequence. He'd spent 8 months cross-referencing port maintenance schedules against cargo movement logs and had learned the interface the way you learn anything you use daily. Not consciously, but through repetition until it became muscle memory. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, Olivia beside him close enough that he could feel the focused attention radiating off her. Emma was at school. The apartment was quiet in the specific morning way that felt different from evening quiet. Lighter, more provisional, like the day hadn't committed to anything yet. He navigated through the menus without explaining each step, just moving. And Olivia watched without asking questions, which he appreciated. People who asked questions while he was establishing a search parameter tended to break the thread. Container classification SL7 through SL12, he said. Same time frame as your manifest. Let's see what the federal logs show for those IDs. The results loaded slowly. The server was clearly not optimized for speed, and the progress bar at the top of the screen moved in that specific way that suggested it was more decorative than functional. Then the data appeared. Mason read it. He read it again. He pulled up a second window alongside the first and opened the scanned copy of Olivia's printed manifest that she'd photographed on his phone the previous evening for reference. There, he said. She leaned forward. The transit time. Container SL9. Your manifest shows it arriving at the Portland terminal on the 14th at 11:42 a.m. He pointed at the federal log. Federal record shows the same container ID being logged at a private warehouse facility in Auburn at 11:09 a.m. on the 14th. Auburn is 40 minutes south of here, she said. You can't be in Auburn at 11:09 and Portland at 11:42. Not without breaking several laws of physics, he said. Which means one of two things. Either the Portland arrival log is fabricated, someone entered it manually after the fact, or the Auburn facility used a cloned container ID to log cargo that wasn't SL9 at all. Both of those are worse than a data entry error. Significantly. She was very still beside him. He could feel the quality of her thinking, the way she held completely motionless when she was processing something that had multiple implications simultaneously. He'd noticed this about her over the past day and a half. Some people talked through their thinking. She went silent. Auburn, she said finally. That facility, do you know it? There are several private warehouse operations in Auburn. I'd need the facility code from the federal log. He looked at the record. WH-4471-A. I don't know that one specifically, but I know someone who might. Who? Guy named Denny Reyes. He runs an equipment repair shop near the port. I did contract work for him for about 2 years. He knows everyone in the logistics corridor between Seattle and Tacoma, every facility, every operator. He paused. He's also got about 3,000 square feet of workspace and nobody watching his parking lot. She looked at him. You want to move? I think we should. Last night, that car... I don't know that it means anything, but I know that your hotel is compromised, and this apartment isn't hard to find if someone followed us from the bus stop 2 nights ago. He closed the laptop. And I'd rather be somewhere that isn't connected to me by an address in any system. Emma, she said immediately. Not a question, a consideration. Mrs. Callahan's. She can stay there tonight. I've done it before when I've had late contract work. He paused. I won't tell her why. Just that I've got a job running late. Olivia looked at the table. He could see the thing she was weighing. The thing she'd been weighing since the conversation about organized criminal networks and stopped cars. The weight of other people becoming part of something she hadn't meant to spread. Mason, she said. I know, he said. You have a daughter. I know that too. This isn't a shipping dispute. If the people running this through my network are who I think they are, then it's better to have an address they can't find than to sit here until they decide to come look, he said. He said it evenly, not to minimize the risk, but because panic about the risk had a specific uselessness he had no patience for. And it's better to have 2 people looking at this data than 1 person alone in a hotel room. She pressed her palms flat on the table, both of them, a grounding gesture. She looked at the closed laptop. Then she looked at him. Okay, she said. He called Denny at 9:30 a.m. Denny Reyes answered on the second ring the way he always did, like he'd been expecting the call and was mildly disappointed it had taken this long. Brooks, Denny said, you finally coming back to do real work, or are you still lifting boxes for those warehouse people? I need a favor, Mason said. Workspace. Quiet. Today, possibly through tomorrow. A pause. Denny was 61 years old and had been operating in the Seattle port corridor for 38 of those years and had developed the particular economy of a man who had seen most things and wasted very little energy on the ones that didn't require it. You in trouble? Not the kind you're thinking. What kind am I thinking? Legal trouble. I'm not in that kind. But there's a kind. There's a kind, Mason confirmed. Another pause, longer this time. You remember where the back gate is? Yeah. Padlock combination is still 11847. Come in the back. I'll leave the side door open. That was Denny. No other questions. Mason had once, during the years they'd worked together, watched Denny help a longshoreman hide a damaged company vehicle in the back of the shop for 3 days while the man figured out what to tell his employer, and the only thing Denny had asked was whether the vehicle was still drivable because he needed to be able to move it if he got a big delivery. Whatever Mason was doing fell well within whatever Denny considered the acceptable range. He called Mrs. Callahan next. She said Emma could stay as long as needed, and then she asked if he was eating properly, because she asked him this every time they spoke. He said yes, and it was partially true, which was close enough. They packed what they needed in 20 minutes. Olivia had almost nothing. The jacket, his sweatpants still folded from the morning, the manifest. Mason took his laptop, the portable hard drive where he kept his work records, a change of clothes, and the engineering manual because he'd been carrying it between rooms for a week, and it seemed wrong to stop now. He also took the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink because it had been his habit to take a first aid kit when doing anything that had a non-zero chance of going badly, a holdover from 6 years of working on vessels where the nearest hospital was variable. He stopped at Mrs. Callahan's on the way and dropped off Emma's overnight bag. Emma accepted this information with the adaptability of a child who had learned that her father sometimes had complications in his schedule, and then she told Olivia, who had come inside briefly, that she expected to hear the rest of the story about the Boston studio apartment and the cooking at some future point. "Deal," Olivia said. Emma hugged Mason around the middle. He held on for an extra second, which he didn't usually do, and Emma noticed because she always noticed things, and she looked up at him with her mother's eyes, steady and dark. "Everything's fine, Bug," he said. "I know," she said. She went back inside without drama. The door closed. Denny's shop was exactly as Mason remembered it, a low, wide building that smelled of machine oil and metal shavings and old coffee from a machine that had been old when Mason first encountered it and had somehow continued functioning through what appeared to be pure stubbornness. The space was organized in the specific way of a man who knew where everything was without necessarily being able to explain the system to anyone else. Equipment on the left wall, parts on the right, the central floor clear for working on whatever needed working on. Today, the central floor had a marine diesel engine in pieces, waiting. Denny was in the back office when they arrived. He came out, looked at Mason, looked at Olivia, looked at Mason again. "This is Olivia," Mason said. "She's in a situation." "She's in my sweatpants," Denny said, because he was observant. "Those are mine," Mason said. "Her clothes are... It's a long story." Denny looked at Olivia with the assessing look of a man who had spent decades evaluating machinery and people with equal directness. "You want coffee?" he said. "Very much," Olivia said. "Machine's from 1994 and it shows," he said, "but it works." He went back to the office and they followed him. The office was small and packed, filing cabinets, a desk covered in invoices, a corkboard with maintenance schedules pinned to it, a small television in the corner showing a weather forecast with the sound off. There were 2 chairs besides Denny's, and they took them. Denny poured 3 coffees from the ancient machine and set them down and sat. "So," he said to Mason. "I need to know about a facility," Mason said. "WH-4471-A out of Auburn, private warehouse. It's showing up in federal terminal logs in a way that doesn't make sense." Denny's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small shift, a kind of attention sharpening. "Where'd you pull that code from?" "Federal Port Access Database, public-facing logs." "And it doesn't make sense how," Mason explained. "The timestamps, the container IDs, the gap between what the federal record showed and what the Sterling Logistics Manifest showed." He laid it out in the ordered, specific way he explained technical things. No editorializing, just the sequence of facts and the logical implication of each one. Denny listened without interrupting, which was his way. When Mason finished, Denny looked at his coffee for a moment. "WH-4471-A, Denny said slowly. "That facility changed hands about 2 years ago. Used to be a cold storage operation, produce, medical supplies, legitimate stuff. New ownership came in, changed the classification to general warehousing, and mostly nobody's been able to figure out what they actually store in there because the facility manifest changes every quarter." "You know who owns it now?" Olivia said. Denny looked at her with the careful look of someone deciding how much to say to someone he didn't know. Then he looked at Mason. Mason nodded slightly. "Ownership is a shell," Denny said. "Something called Pacific Meridian Holdings. I only know because one of my guys tried to get a contract there about a year ago, and when he looked into the company to do the background check before agreeing to the work, he couldn't find a human being attached to it anywhere, just addresses that went to other addresses. He walked away from the contract." "Smart," Olivia said quietly. "He thought so." Denny drank his coffee. "The name Pacific Meridian Holdings meaning anything to you?" "Not specifically," Olivia said, But I know what to do with it. She looked at Mason. He knew what she was thinking, the same thing he was thinking. A shell company with a facility in the federal terminal logs, container IDs that showed up in two places simultaneously, Sterling Logistics manifest that covered the gap. Someone had built an infrastructure specifically designed to move things through the port corridor, while a second set of records made it look like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The scale of it was beginning to develop a shape, and the shape was not small. They worked at Denny's for the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. Denny gave them the far corner of the office with the folding table he kept for inventory work, and then went to work on his diesel engine and left them to it, checking in occasionally with more coffee, and once with a sandwich he split 3 ways without comment. Mason pulled the federal terminal logs for the full 18-month window he had access to and began cross-referencing container IDs against the section of manifest Olivia had. It was painstaking work. The database wasn't designed for cross-referencing between classifications, which meant he had to pull records manually by ID range and sort them in a spreadsheet before the patterns became visible. He built the spreadsheet from scratch, constructing the columns with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent years reading maintenance logs and understood that the truth in complex data was always in the gaps, not the entries. Olivia worked alongside him, reading the manifest sections he highlighted, catching discrepancies he flagged, and doing something on her end that he didn't fully follow. A handwritten reconstruction of the company's internal routing calendar from memory, month by month, cross-checking it against what the federal logs showed to identify windows where the discrepancy was widest. March, she said at one point. March of last year? Look at the volume. He pulled up March. She was right. The gap between what Sterling Logistics reported and what the federal terminals showed was nearly 3 times the average for the other months in the window. What was happening in March, he asked. She thought about it. We had a major contract renewal with the Pacific Rim Consortium. It was the biggest single contract in company history. The operations team was running at full capacity. Everyone focused on the new contract logistics, nobody looking at routine legacy routes. She paused. Someone knew that. Someone used the distraction. Someone with access to the operations calendar. Yes. He wrote that down. Not on the computer. In a small notebook he'd found in the bottom of his laptop bag, the kind with the cardboard cover that cost $1 at a drugstore. He wrote in the compressed, efficient handwriting of someone who took notes to remember things rather than to look organized. The containers that show up at WH4471A, he said, not looking up from the notebook. What classification are they? She looked at the federal logs on his screen. Mixed. General cargo, some classified as industrial equipment parts, a few as textiles. That's the cover, he said. Industrial equipment parts is the loosest classification in the federal system for things that don't fit cleanly into other categories. It gets the least scrutiny at customs unless you've got a specific flag. You know a lot about customs classifications for someone who does equipment maintenance. I spent 8 months at the port. You learn things. He looked up. The people using your network, they're not amateurs. Whoever built this routing scheme understood the federal classification system well enough to pick the categories that attract minimum attention, understood Sterling Logistics' internal operations well enough to time the heaviest use to your distraction periods, and understood the shell company structure well enough to make Pacific Meridian holdings untraceable through normal means. He paused. That's not one person. That's a team. Inside the company, she said, at least partially inside the company. You need the routing system access for the manifest falsification. That has to be internal. He leaned back in the chair. But the shell company, the Auburn facility, the external coordination, that's somebody outside. Or somebody who used to be inside and left a door open. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her think through it, the systematic quality of it, the way she held multiple threads simultaneously without appearing to lose any of them. He had a feeling she was exceptionally good at her job. He had a feeling she was also, at this particular moment, trying not to think about how long this had been running and what that meant about the people she'd trusted. My COO, she said finally. Richard Calloway. He's been with the company for 7 years. He built the operations division. Is he capable of this? She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He's capable of building a system that runs at this level. Absolutely. He's one of the best operational minds I've ever worked with. She paused, and the pause had weight in it, which is the thing that makes it, I don't know. I don't know for certain that it's him. I have a list of 15 people with the access level required. He's on that list, but he's at the top of it. She didn't answer immediately. He was the person who suggested the Pacific Rim contract focus in March, she said. It was his recommendation that we pull the senior operations team entirely onto the new contract implementation and run legacy routes on automated protocols. He presented it as a resource optimization. She stopped. If I'm right, that recommendation created the window he needed. Mason let that sit. He understood what it cost her to say it. Not grief, exactly, but the specific and disorienting pain of realizing that competence you'd trusted and relied on had been pointed in a direction you hadn't known about. You can't confront him, Mason said. Not yet. Not without more. I know that. If he knows you're close, I know, she said, more sharply than she'd said anything. Then, after a beat, I know. I'm not going to do anything with what we have right now. I know how much we'd need to make something stick legally. This isn't enough. What would be enough? She thought. The warehouse. What's actually moving through WH4471A. That's the piece that turns this from manifest discrepancies, which could be argued as system errors, into something that can't be explained away. If we can establish what's actually in those containers and show the routing manipulation was designed specifically to obscure it, we need someone with the authority to compel access to that facility, he said. Federal investigators, Commerce, or potentially FBI, depending on what we find in there. Which means we need to be ready to take this somewhere official. Which means we need to be very sure of what we're presenting before we do, she said. Because the moment I go to federal investigators with this, it will not be quiet. And if I'm wrong, you're not wrong, he said. She looked at him. How do you know? Because the timestamps don't lie, he said. The federal logs don't care who you are or what you think happened. SL9 cannot be in Auburn at 11:09 and Portland at 11:42. That's not an opinion. That's arithmetic. He looked at the spreadsheet on his screen. And there are 47 other instances in this 18-month window where the same pattern repeats. Different containers, different dates, same impossible simultaneity. 47 isn't a clerical error. 47 is a system. She held his gaze. He thought, not for the first time, that she had a quality of stillness in her face when something registered deeply, like the information went inward without visible disturbance on the surface. 47, she said. I'll have the full count confirmed by tonight. She nodded. She looked back at the screen, at the columns of timestamps and container IDs that added up to something considerably larger than a shipping dispute. Then she looked at the window. Denny's shop window faced the back lot, just gravel and a chain-link fence, and beyond it the flat gray of the afternoon sky. My board of directors, she said, almost to herself. Richard's been in contact with them about... I've been out of communication for 4 days. My phone is gone, I haven't been reachable, and Richard is the person who would be managing board communications in my absence. She paused. He'll be shaping the narrative of where I am and why. What narrative would he want to shape? She pressed her lips together. If I were building a takeover strategy and the CEO went dark for 4 days while I had access to the board, she stopped. I'd say she's unstable, erratic. I'd say she left without warning, she's not answering communications. The company needs steady leadership during the uncertainty. I'd position myself as the steady option. How receptive would the board be to that? There are 3 members who've been on the board since the beginning. They'd push back hard. She paused. There are 4 who came on in the last 2 years through a restructuring Richard recommended. Mason picked up the cheap notebook. He wrote down Richard Calloway's name. He wrote the word board next to it. He wrote the date of the last time Olivia had been in contact with anyone inside her company. We're running out of time on 2 fronts, he said. The data and the board. I'm aware of that. Which one do we solve first? She didn't hesitate. The data. Without the data, nothing I say to the board matters. I walk back in there and say, I think Richard is running a criminal operation through the company's logistics network, and I've been in Seattle for 4 days without any communication, and I have no evidence I can put in front of them. She shook her head. I look like exactly what he's been telling them I am. Then we get the data tonight. She looked at him. What do you mean tonight? The federal logs are pulling slow because I'm working through the public interface. But there's a Port Authority terminal at the Shipping Authority office on Harbor Avenue that has direct access to the full records database, not just the public-facing window. Unfiltered logs, every scan, every timestamp, every facility code. He paused. I still have a contractor access card from my port work. It was never deactivated when the contract ended because the company that held the contract dissolved before the administrative process caught up. He looked at her. Technically, it's still valid. Technically. Technically, she was looking at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, the one that assessed whether he understood what he was proposing. He did. She could see that he did. That's not nothing, she said. I know what it is, he said. I also know that what we pull from those full records will be substantially more complete than what I can get from the public interface, and substantially more credible when we take it somewhere official, because it comes directly from the Port Authority's own system and carries its timestamp metadata intact. He paused. The public logs can be argued. The raw terminal records can't. Denny appeared in the doorway from the shop floor, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at both of them with the equanimity of a man who had heard part of a conversation he was too experienced to pretend he hadn't heard. Harbor Avenue office closes at 6, he said. If you're going, go before that. Night security is one guy named Garrett, who mostly watches sports on his phone. He takes a smoke break at the back entrance at 7:15 and 9:45. They both looked at him. I've had to pull records from there after hours before, Denny said, without any particular expression. For legitimate reasons. Equipment verification. I'm just saying, the timing matters. He looked at Mason. You know what you're doing in that system? Yeah, Mason said. Then take a USB drive. The export function on those terminals is temperamental, but if you right-click the records panel and use the secondary export option, not the main one, it dumps a clean CSV file. The main export corrupts about half the time. Mason looked at his old boss for a moment. Denny went back to his diesel engine without another word. They left the shop at 5:20 in Denny's spare truck, a gray F-150 with a cracked side mirror and a stereo that only got 2 stations, because Mason's car was potentially known and Denny had handed over the keys without being asked, which was, Mason thought, simply Denny being Denny. The drive to Harbor Avenue was 20 minutes in the late afternoon traffic. Olivia sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the city move past outside. The light was doing the thing it did in Seattle in late afternoon on clear days after rain, low and amber, landing on the wet streets with a kind of reluctant warmth, like it was making up for the previous night's indifference. You didn't have to do any of this, she said, not looking at him. I know. You could have just let me handle it when the bank's sorted out. The bank's not sorted for another day, he said. And you'd still be in the hotel by yourself with one manifest page and a slow public database. I would have managed. Probably, he said. But managed isn't the same as solved. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you always help people like this? He thought about it. I fix things, he said. It's what I do. Somebody's got a broken engine. I'd rather fix it than watch it run wrong. He shrugged. This is a broken system. The principle's the same. I'm not an engine. No, he agreed. But the problem you've got has the same quality as a mechanical problem. There's a fault in the system, and it has a source. And if you trace the fault back far enough, you get to the source. He checked the mirror. An automatic thing, just looking. The street behind them was ordinary. That's fixable. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. He was watching the road. She looked at the side of his face for a moment, the set of his jaw, the particular steadiness of him, the way he held the wheel with one hand in the easy, not quite conscious way of someone who spent a lot of time driving. And she thought about the night of the bus stop, the woman sitting in the rain deciding whether to trust a stranger, and the specific quality of this particular stranger that had made the decision feel, even then, less complicated than it should have been. She didn't say any of that. She turned back to the window. "Emma's going to want the rest of the cooking story," she said. "She will," he agreed. "She's relentless about follow-up." "She gets that from you," Olivia said. He glanced at her sideways. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're still working a problem at 5 o'clock in the evening that you had nothing to do with 3 days ago, and you haven't stopped once to ask for anything in return." She paused. "That's a form of relentlessness." He didn't have a response to that, and she didn't expect one. The truck moved through the amber light toward Harbor Avenue. The shipping authority office was a squat, practical building that looked exactly like what it was. A place where administrative work got done, and nobody had put any budget toward making it pleasant to look at. The parking lot was half empty at this hour. The main entrance had a glass door with the Port Authority seal and hours posted in faded print. Mason's contractor card got them through the side entrance. The card reader beeped and the light went green, and he kept his expression neutral as they went inside. Because the nervousness was there, he was not someone who did things like this routinely, and he had enough respect for his own honesty to acknowledge that this was operating in a gray area. But the nervousness was less than the certainty that what was in these records mattered. The terminal room was on the second floor, reached by a stairway that smelled of old carpet. 3 workstations, 2 of them dark, one with a screensaver running. Mason sat at the active terminal, cleared the screensaver, and navigated to the full records database. He pulled up the contractor access menu and entered his credentials. The system accepted them. Olivia stood behind him, and he could feel her stillness. The held breath quality of it, the focus. He typed in the container ID range. He set the timestamp window to 30 months. He let it run. The data came back in 37 seconds. Not the thin slice the public interface had returned, but the full unfiltered record. Every scan point, every facility code, every timestamp from every terminal in the Pacific Northwest corridor that had touched a Sterling logistics container in the past 2.5 years. He right-clicked the records panel, found the secondary export option, the one Denny had told him about, clicked it. The progress bar, a real one this time, moving steadily, filled from left to right. "How many records?" Olivia said quietly. He looked at the count in the corner of the screen. 4,312 individual scan events. She was very still. "And in there," he said, watching the export run, "is every discrepancy, every impossible timestamp, every time a container showed up in 2 places at once. All of it, with the metadata intact." He paused. "No one argues with this." The export completed. He pulled the USB drive, a $10 one from a gas station he'd bought on the way, from his pocket and plugged it in. He transferred the file. He verified the transfer. He removed the drive. He cleared the terminal of his search history, logged out of the contractor credentials, and stood up. The whole process had taken 11 minutes. They went back down the stairs and out the side entrance without seeing anyone except one administrator heading for the elevator with a coffee cup and a look of someone whose mind was already in the parking lot. She didn't look at them. Outside, the amber light was gone. The sky had moved to that deep gray blue that came just before dark, and the air had the particular chill of Seattle evenings in that season. Not quite cold enough for a coat, but enough to make you aware you should have one. Olivia stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking up at the sky, and Mason thought she was doing the thing where you let the outside air hit you after something compressed and confined. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "No, I don't know." She looked at him. 47 instances from the public logs, 4,000 scan events from the full record. Whatever's in that CSV file, it's going to be a lot worse than 47. "Probably," he said. "I built that company," she said. "It came out quietly, without performance. I started it from a 3-person operation in a warehouse in Chicago when I was 24 years old. Every contract, every expansion, every route. I know every corridor in that network." She paused. "And someone used it for years, and I didn't see it." He didn't offer her consolation about that. It would have been the wrong thing. "You're seeing it now," he said. She looked at him. The light was almost gone, and her face in the near dark had a different quality than it did in the apartment, in Denny's office, more unguarded, like the dark removed the need for the last remaining layer. "Why did you bring the first aid kit?" she said, which was not what he'd expected her to say. "Force of habit," he said. "From the Navy?" "Yeah." She looked at him for another moment. "Okay," she said. She turned toward the truck. "Let's go look at what we found." They drove back to Denny's in the dark, and the city spread out around them with its ordinary evening activity. Restaurants filling up, people heading home, the port in the distance with its lights running on the cranes, steady and rhythmic, the machinery of commerce moving in the dark the way it always did, indifferent to everything being discovered about what moved inside it. Mason had the USB drive in his jacket pocket. He could feel it there, a small, specific weight, $10 of plastic and circuitry containing 4,312 pieces of evidence that something had gone wrong inside one of the largest logistics networks on the continent. He thought about Olivia saying, "I built that company," in the parking lot, the particular nakedness of it, the way it wasn't a boast, but a grief. He thought about the diesel engine in pieces in the middle of Denny's shop floor, waiting to be put back together. He thought about Emma asking if Olivia was worried about something besides getting robbed, and about how the answer had turned out to be yes, considerably, and that the something was large enough to require a contractor access card and a second-hand USB drive and a man who knew how to read port routing logs and had nothing to gain from any of it except the particular satisfaction of watching a broken system stop running wrong. He thought that was probably enough reason. He drove. The CSV file opened at 11:14 p.m. on Denny's folding table, under a single work lamp that cast a yellowish cone of light over the keyboard and left the rest of the shop in shadow. The diesel engine in pieces on the main floor had taken on a different quality in the dark, less like a mechanical problem waiting to be solved and more like the skeleton of something, ribs and chambers exposed, patient. Mason had been working for 2 hours straight. His coffee had gone cold 40 minutes ago, and he hadn't noticed until he picked it up and put it back down without drinking it. Olivia sat to his right with the notebook, his cheap cardboard-covered notebook, and a pen she'd found in Denny's desk drawer, and she was tracking the pattern he was building column by column, writing the container IDs and timestamp discrepancies in a handwriting that was small and precise and moved fast across the page. The file was worse than 47. It was worse by a factor that neither of them said out loud for the first hour, just absorbed in increments as the data organized itself into a picture that had been there the whole time, hiding in plain sight inside 4,312 ordinary-looking scan records. The number they finally arrived at was 219. 219 instances across 30 months where a Sterling Logistics container appeared in federal terminal records at a facility, WH4471A, or one of 3 other sites that shared the Pacific Meridian Holdings ownership structure, at a timestamp that was physically incompatible with its logged position in the Sterling system. 219 gaps in the official record, each one a window through which cargo had moved unreported, unscrutinized, invisible to every layer of oversight that was supposed to be watching. 219, Olivia said. She said it quietly, looking at the number Mason had written at the bottom of the notebook page, and circled twice. "Over 30 months, he said. "That's roughly 7 per month on average. But the distribution isn't even." He pulled up the frequency analysis he'd built in the spreadsheet. "It clusters. Heavy in March last year, like we saw. Again in August. Again in January." He paused. "Those are the windows where your internal operations were at peak capacity on other projects. Someone was timing it." "Richard presents the quarterly project allocation every month," she said, "to the senior operations team. The full schedule." She stopped. Anyone in that room would know exactly when the legacy route monitoring would be thinnest. "How many people are in that room?" 12. 15 on a big quarter." She looked at the screen. "I've worked with most of them for years." He didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say about it. He kept working. What he was building now was the second layer of the analysis, not just the discrepancies, but the pattern of which containers carried which classification codes, and what that revealed about what was actually moving through WH4471A. The industrial equipment parts classification appeared in 63% of the flagged containers, textiles in 22%. The remaining 15% were logged as general cargo with no subclassification, which was the loosest category the federal system allowed and required the least documentation to process. The industrial equipment parts containers, he said. In the federal records, they're scanned at WH4471A with a duration log. I can see how long they sat at the facility before the next scan. And most commercial industrial cargo turns around in 24 to 72 hours, standard processing time. He pointed at the screen. These are sitting for 3 to 5 days on average before their next recorded movement, and their next recorded movement is never back into the Sterling logistics system. They just stop appearing. She leaned forward. They exit the tracking system entirely. Yes. After WH4471A, they disappear from every federal scan record. No onward destination logged, no customs clearance on the other end. He looked at her. You can't do that with commercial cargo. The federal system requires an exit scan. The only way a container stops appearing in the tracking system is if it's either destroyed, which generates its own record, or if it exits through a channel that isn't covered by standard terminal scanning. Private transport, she said. Road or private maritime. Private maritime, he said. Has to be. The volume is too large for road over that period without generating other records. We're talking about containers, not parcels. He pulled up a map of the Puget Sound on the browser. Auburn is 25 miles from the water. A private dock operation with its own equipment could transfer cargo directly to a vessel that never officially enters a federal terminal. He traced the route with his finger. The cargo comes in through Sterling Logistics' legitimate network, gets diverted at a point in the routing where the false manifest covers the gap, sits at Auburn for processing, and goes out on a private vessel to wherever it's actually going. The Sterling system shows it delivered on time. The federal system shows it in transit indefinitely. Nobody's looking hard enough at either record to catch the mismatch. Olivia was completely still. She had the quality, in that moment, of someone standing at the edge of a thing much larger than they'd expected when they started walking toward it. How much money? She said. It wasn't really a question. I can't tell you what the cargo is worth. I don't know what they're moving, but in terms of the operational infrastructure, he looked at his notes, 219 container movements over 30 months, each one requiring coordination between someone inside your company, the Auburn facility, and the private export operation. That's not a side project, that's a business. He paused. Running inside your business. She stood up from the table. She walked to the far wall of Denny's office and stood there with her back to him for a moment, her arms crossed. He watched her. He had learned over the past 2 days not to fill her silences with noise. She used them. Richard, she said, still facing the wall. Probably the internal piece, yes, he said. But the external network, Pacific Meridian Holdings, the Auburn facility, the private maritime operation, that was built by someone with resources and legal sophistication to set up the shell structure. That's either a separate criminal organization that recruited him, or he was recruited before he came to me, she said. She turned around. 7 years ago, Richard came to Sterling through a recommendation from a board member who has since retired. He came with impeccable references and a track record in operations management that checked out completely. She paused. What if the track record was real, but the reasons for being at Sterling were not? You think he was placed? I think it's possible that someone wanted access to a growing logistics network in the Pacific Corridor and identified Sterling as the best vehicle for it, and Richard as the best means of access. She came back to the table. She sat down. I think it's possible I've been building the infrastructure for someone else's operation without knowing it for 7 years. The flat way she said it, without self-pity, without dramatization, just the plain assessment of a possibility that was terrible and needed to be looked at directly, was, he thought, one of the most difficult things he'd seen anyone do. The easiest response to that kind of realization was to push it sideways, to qualify it, to find a reason it wasn't quite as bad as it looked. She just looked at it. You built a legitimate company, he said. Whatever someone else used it for,
That's not the same thing. I know that, she said. It doesn't make it better. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They sat for a moment in the quiet of Denny's office, the work lamp between them, the spreadsheet on the screen, the notebook with 219 circled at the bottom of a page. Somewhere in the shop, a pipe knocked once with the particular sound of old buildings settling in the cold. We need to take this somewhere, Olivia said. Tomorrow. Federal investigators, Commerce for the manifest falsification, potentially FBI for the criminal enterprise angle. I have a contact, she said, an attorney in Chicago who handles regulatory matters for the company. She's not connected to Richard's network. She's been my personal counsel, not company counsel, for 3 years. I trust her. She paused. I need a phone. He handed her his. She dialed from memory. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. It was past 11 p.m. in Chicago. And she left a message that was precise and brief, and revealed nothing about the specifics except that it was urgent and that the attorney should expect a call first thing in the morning. She handed the phone back. Now the board, he said. Now the board, she agreed. If Richard has had 4 days to work on them, can you reach any of the original 3? The ones who were there from the beginning? Margaret Chu. She was my first outside investor. She's been on the board since year 2. Olivia looked at the phone in her hand. She doesn't trust Richard. She's never trusted Richard. She told me once, 3 years ago, that he had the quality of a man who was always looking at the room behind the room. She paused. I thought it was just a personality clash. Call her, he said. It's 11 p.m. You said it yourself, for Richard has had 4 days. She looked at the phone. She dialed. Margaret Chu answered on the second ring, which told them something. Olivia. The voice on the other end was calm and careful, the way voices are when they've been waiting for a call and have had time to prepare for it. Where are you? Seattle, I'm safe. I need you to listen to me. I've been listening to Richard Calloway for 4 days, Margaret said. I was hoping you'd call before he finished talking. A pause. He's calling a board session for tomorrow morning. Emergency session. Agenda item 1 is leadership stability. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. Mason watched it happen from across the table. How many votes does he have? Olivia said. Going into tomorrow? Possibly 4. Vanderholt and Cheng are leaning his direction. Kim is undecided. Another pause. I've been holding the other 2, but I can't hold them indefinitely without something to give them, Olivia. I have something, she said. I have considerably more than something. I need the board session delayed by 48 hours. On what grounds? On the grounds that the CEO has requested it, which I'm doing now, formally. Get that on record, Margaret. Timestamp it. A brief silence. Done. I'll register it in the morning when the corporate secretary opens. That delays the session by 48 hours under the charter. A pause. Calloway is going to push back. Let him push. I need 48 hours. You'll have them. What are you going to do with them? I'm going to come home, Olivia said, and I'm going to bring something with me that changes the conversation. She hung up. She set the phone down on the table and sat for a moment with her eyes closed, not in the way of someone who was losing composure, but in the way of someone recalibrating, adjusting to the new coordinates of the situation. 48 hours, Mason said. Yes. Your attorney in the morning, then travel to Chicago. Yes. She opened her eyes. There's a piece missing, she said. What piece? Everything I have right now is records, timestamps, container IDs, manifest discrepancies. It's compelling, and I believe it's airtight, but a skilled attorney, and Richard will have skilled attorneys, can argue that records are records. They can argue system errors, data corruption, unauthorized access to federal terminals. She looked at him directly. They'll use the way we obtain the records to undermine the records themselves. He thought about this. She was right. He'd pulled the data on a contractor card that was technically valid but contextually questionable, and any defense attorney worth the billing rate would make that the story instead of the data. We need a corroborating source, he said. We need something that exists independently, something that neither side can claim was obtained improperly. She paused. Something that a federal investigator can reach through their own channels once we give them the direction to look.
He turned back to the screen. He pulled up the Pacific Meridian Holdings search he'd done earlier in the day. The limited public information about the shell company, the address that led to another address, the complete absence of any named human being in the ownership structure. He stared at it for a moment. Shell Company and Corporation records, he said slowly. They're public in most states. You can hide the beneficial owner, but you can't completely remove the registered agent. He typed into the browser. Pacific Meridian Holdings, incorporated in Delaware. The Delaware Corporate Registry was accessible online. He navigated to it. He searched the name. The registered agent was a law firm, Harmon & Briggs, Wilmington, Delaware. Standard for shell companies, law firms served as registered agents for hundreds of entities, and it meant nothing about the beneficial owner. But it was a thread. Harmon & Briggs, Olivia said, reading over his shoulder. I know that name. He turned. From where? She was very still. From a contract negotiation, 3 years ago. We were expanding our East Coast operations, and there was a competing bid for a port services contract in Baltimore. The competing company's counsel was from Harmon & Briggs. She paused. The competing company lost the bid. Richard was the one who presented our counterproposal. I remember because it was unusually aggressive. We undercut the competitor in a way that surprised me at the time. You made sure you won the bid, Mason said, against a company whose law firm is also the registered agent for the shell company running cargo through my network. She said it flatly. Then, either that's a coincidence, or the competing company in Baltimore was part of the same network, Mason said. And Richard made sure Sterling won that contract so the network would have access to both port corridors. She put both hands flat on the table. He recognized the gesture, grounding herself against the scale of it, the way the picture kept expanding every time they thought they'd seen the edges. We need to stop pulling threads tonight, she said. Or we'll be here until morning and I need to be functional tomorrow. Agreed, he said. He saved the spreadsheet, ejected the USB drive, and closed the laptop. He looked at the notebook with its pages of handwriting and circled numbers. I'm going to make a copy of this, he said. Denny has a scanner. At 11:30 p.m.? He has it on his desk, and it's plugged in. I assume he uses it. He picked up the notebook. 2 copies. Different locations. That's basic. She didn't argue. He scanned the pages, emailed the scans to an account he created specifically for the purpose on a free mail service, and printed 2 hard copies on Denny's printer, which jammed once and produced a slightly skewed final page that was nonetheless legible. He gave 1 copy to Olivia. She folded it and put it in the interior pocket of her jacket alongside the original manifest page. They left Denny's at midnight. Denny himself had gone home at 10, leaving the side door unlocked and a note on the office desk that said, back at 7. Don't break anything. Mason turned off the work lamp and locked the side door from the outside with the key Denny had left. The night air was cold and clear, no rain. Above the city, the sky was that particular deep urban dark that wasn't truly dark, too much ambient light for stars except the brightest, a kind of permanent orange-gray glow that sat above the buildings like a second ceiling. Mason looked at it for a moment before he got in the truck. They drove back to the apartment without talking much. The city at midnight had its own particular quality. Not quite empty, never empty, but reduced to its essential traffic. Night shift workers, late restaurant closings, the occasional delivery truck. The port lights visible in the distance over the roofline, steady and indifferent. You need to sleep, he said. I know. And I need to get Emma from Mrs. Callahan's in the morning before I do anything else. Of course, she said. She said it like it went without saying, which he noticed. At the apartment, he unlocked the door and they went in, and the familiar smell of the place, coffee, the faint residual warmth of the heater, the indefinable smell of a home that was lived in, settled around them in the particular way that spaces do when you've been somewhere else and come back. He was tired in a deep way, the kind that wasn't just about hours but about the sustained concentration of the day, the quality of attention it had required to move through 4,312 records without missing something. He was also, underneath the tiredness, running at a frequency he recognized from his engineering work. The specific aliveness of being close to the solution of a complex problem, the way the last pieces of a diagnostic had a different energy than the first ones. He made 2 glasses of water and put one on the coffee table for Olivia and drank his own standing in the kitchen. "There's one more thing," she said from the living room doorway. He turned. "The attorney tomorrow morning. When I talk to her and she starts working with the investigators, they're going to want a technical expert, someone who can explain the routing analysis to people who aren't engineers." She looked at him. "I'd like it to be you." He set down his glass. "That's a significant ask." "I know. You're asking me to put my name on this officially, go on record." "Yes," she said, "and I understand what that means for you. The contractor card access, That's not what I'm thinking about," he said. She waited. He was thinking about Emma, about the slow car on the street outside the apartment 2 nights ago, about the fact that whatever was running through Pacific Meridian Holdings and WH4471A was not small and not amateur, and that people who built that kind of operation did not respond well to being dismantled. He was thinking that he had already, by pulling those terminal records, made himself part of this, whether he put his name on anything or not. The only question was whether he was part of it in a way that had any protective structure around it, or whether he was just a guy who'd done something questionable with a contractor card and had a USB drive in his jacket. "I want my daughter safe," he said, "before I do anything public. I want her somewhere that isn't connected to me by an obvious address." "Margaret Chu has a property in Portland," Olivia said immediately. "I can call her in the morning. She'd take Emma without asking too many questions, and her security is not connected to anything Richard can access." He looked at her. She'd had that ready. She'd been thinking about Emma's position in this before he'd asked. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, I'll do it," he said. "When Emma's safe." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Not the reflexive kind, the kind that came from somewhere. "Don't thank me until it works," he said. He set up the sofa without being asked, the blue blanket, the glass of water on the coffee table. He went to bed. He did not fall asleep immediately this time. He lay on his back in the dark and went through the data in his head, the way he went through mechanical diagnostics, building the argument in sequence, anticipating the objections, identifying the points where the chain of evidence was strong and the points where it would need support. The Harmon and Briggs connection was a thread, not a proof. The shell company structure was suggestive, not definitive. What was definitive was the 219 impossible timestamps. Those could not be argued. Those were arithmetic. He thought about the boardroom. Olivia walking back into her company with a USB drive and a handwritten notebook, and a man who had recently been lifting warehouse cargo and cleaning windows. He thought about what that room would look like. The table, the suits, the man who had spent 4 days positioning himself in the space where Olivia was supposed to be. He thought about Richard Calloway, who Mason had never met, hearing that the CEO had returned from wherever she'd been with evidence assembled by a port maintenance contractor who had no formal role in the company and no standing in the room. He thought about how that would play. He thought it would play badly for Richard, because the timestamps were what they were regardless of who had found them, and because Olivia Sterling walking into that room would not look like the unstable, absent CEO that Richard had spent 4 days describing. She would look like what she was, someone who had been working. He fell asleep at 1:30 a.m. At 6:45 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Callahan asking what time he'd be by for Emma and whether Emma had eaten breakfast because she'd had 3 biscuits already and was showing signs of requesting a 4th. He typed back that he'd be there by 8 and that the 4th biscuit was at Mrs. Callahan's discretion. He came out to the kitchen and found Olivia already up, already dressed in her own jacket over his clothes, her hair pulled back, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a pen in her hand. She looked up when he came in. "I was reviewing the sequence," she said, "for the attorney call. I want to be organized." "How long have you been up?" "A while?" He looked at her. She looked like someone who had slept badly but was not going to mention it. He started the coffee. The attorney called at 7:18 a.m., which was 9:18 in Chicago, and Olivia took the call at the kitchen table while Mason drove to pick up Emma. He listened to the first 2 minutes before he left. Enough to know that the attorney, whose name was Diane Farrell, was not someone who wasted time on reactions. She asked 4 rapid questions, got 4 rapid answers, and said she'd have a contact at the Commerce Department's office of Inspector General on the line within the hour. Emma was on her 4th biscuit when he arrived, sitting at Mrs. Callahan's kitchen table with the air of someone who felt the biscuit situation had been managed correctly. She climbed into the car with her overnight bag and immediately asked if Olivia was still at the apartment. "She is," he said. "Is she still worried about the thing that wasn't just getting robbed?" He looked in the rearview mirror. "Yeah." "Is it getting better?" "It is," he said. "We're working on it." Emma seemed to accept this. She looked out the window for a moment. Is she going to have to go away soon? He thought about Chicago, about the board session in 48 hours, about Diane Farrell making calls from her Chicago office while they drove through a Seattle morning that had come up bright and cold and clear as glass. "Probably," he said. "Okay," Emma said, and then, because she was her mother's daughter in the way that she absorbed difficult things without requiring them to be made into something easier, "I hope she fixes it." "She will," he said, and he believed that. Back at the apartment, the situation had moved. Olivia was off the phone and standing in the middle of the living room with an expression that was controlled, but had something running underneath it that was new. Not fear exactly, but a state of heightened alertness, the kind that arrived when things accelerated past the pace you'd planned for. "Diane talked to her contact at Commerce," Olivia said, before he'd gotten Emma's bag down from his shoulder. "They already have a file on Pacific Meridian Holdings." He went still. "They do. 18 months old. Started as a routine review of shell company structures in the Pacific Rim corridor and flagged Pacific Meridian for the same shell layering that Denny described. Addresses leading to addresses, no beneficial owner." She paused. "They didn't have the Sterling Logistics connection. They didn't have the container IDs or the timestamp analysis, but the company was already on their radar. Which means when we hand them what we have, it's not a cold start," she said. "They have context for it. Diane says the OIG contact wants to see the data today. Not tomorrow. Today." Emma had gone still in the hallway, taking in the room's energy with the particular sensitivity of children to adult tension. Mason looked at her. "Hey, Bug, can you go put your bag in your room?" She went without argument, which told him she understood this was serious. He looked at Olivia. "Today changes the timeline." Significantly. She was watching him. "I can send Diane the data files electronically, but the OIG contact says they want in-person testimony about the methodology, Sam. How the analysis was built, how the terminal records were accessed and interpreted. They want it before they move on the board session angle, because if we're going to use this to preempt Richard's emergency session, we need the federal piece moving first." She paused. "They want both of us in Chicago." "Both of us," he said. "You built the analysis. You pulled the records. You can explain the routing methodology in a way that I can't, not because I don't understand it, but because I'm the CEO of the company at the center of it. My objectivity will be challenged. Yours won't." She looked at him steadily. "You're the independent expert. That's not nothing, Mason. That's the thing that makes the technical evidence credible to someone who doesn't already believe me." He stood in his living room, the same living room with the library books and the engineering manual, and the framed photo of Emma with her gap-toothed smile. And he thought about the practical shape of what she was asking. Chicago, today. Emma with Margaret Chu in Portland, which meant a call he hadn't made yet to a woman he'd never met, asking her to take his daughter to another city on short notice because a billionaire he'd known for 4 days needed it to happen. He thought about his warehouse shift, which he'd now missed 2 days of, about the window cleaning contract, about the $31 in tip money. He thought about the diesel engine in Denny's shop and the conversation he'd had with himself about fixing things that were running wrong. "Call Margaret Chu," he said. "Get Emma sorted first. Then we figure out Chicago." Olivia nodded and reached for his phone. He went to Emma's room. She was sitting on her bed with her stuffed rabbit, not playing with it, just holding it in her lap. She looked up when he came in. "We have to go somewhere," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed. I need to go help Olivia with something important, and while I do that, you're going to stay with a friend of hers in Portland for a few days." "Portland," Emma said. She considered the word like a geography problem. "That's where Mrs. Callahan's son lives." "Different part of Portland." "Is it safe?" The question was simple and direct, and it landed in him solidly. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, and asking the question that most adults would have spent 10 minutes walking sideways up to. "Yes," he said. "It's safe. I need you away from here for a little bit, that's all. Not because anything is wrong, but because I need to be able to focus on what I'm doing without worrying about you." She thought about this with the seriousness she gave things that deserved it. "Okay," she said. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes," he said. "Promise?" He looked at her. He did not promise things he wasn't certain of, as a rule. Emma knew this about him, had known it since she was old enough to understand the difference between a promise and an intention. "I'm going to be very careful," he said. "That's what I can promise." She considered this and found it sufficient. She picked up her stuffed rabbit. "Can I bring Franklin?" "You can bring Franklin." She started repacking her bag. In the living room, Olivia was on the phone with Margaret Chu, and from what Mason could hear as he passed through to the kitchen, Margaret had asked no questions beyond the logistical ones, and had said Emma could arrive that evening. He filed this information about Margaret Chu, a woman who asked the right amount of questions and no more, and set it in the same category as Denny Reyes handing over truck keys without elaboration. The people who turned out to matter in situations like this were rarely the ones who needed to understand everything before they'd move. He booked 2 flights to Chicago at the kitchen table on his phone. Economy, because the option was not lost on him that he was booking a plane ticket on a budget that classified $31 in tip money as a meaningful sum, and he was doing it next to a woman whose company had a $12 billion valuation. He booked them anyway. He'd figure out the invoice later. Olivia saw what he was doing and opened her mouth. He shook his head slightly. "You can sort it out when your accounts are accessible," he said. She closed her mouth. He could see it cost her something. The same thing it had cost her to accept the soup at Patty's Diner 4 nights ago, the reflex of someone who did not like carrying debts she couldn't balance. He understood it. He also understood that arguing about it at this particular moment was the wrong use of the next 10 minutes. They left the apartment at noon, Emma with her bag and Franklin the rabbit, Mason with his laptop and the USB drive and a change of clothes, Olivia with her jacket and the manifest page, and the notebook copies and nothing else, because she still had nothing else. And somehow she carried this the same way she carried everything, without making it about itself. Mason locked the apartment door and stood for a moment in the hallway outside it. The light above 4C buzzed slightly, the way it always did. He looked at the door. Plain wood, old brass numbers, the mark on the frame from where the previous tenant had hung a wreath and left a nail, and then he went down the stairs. They drove Emma to the airport first. Margaret Chu had sent a car, a clean, plain sedan driven by a woman who showed Olivia a specific credential when they arrived at the departures level, something that apparently satisfied whatever Olivia needed it to satisfy, because Olivia nodded and looked at Emma. Emma looked at the car, then at her father, then at Olivia. "You're going to fix it," Emma said to Olivia. Not a question, a statement, the way she made statements about things she'd decided were true. "We're going to try," Olivia said. Emma considered this. Then she looked at Mason with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: trust and worry, and the particular love of a child for a parent that has no convenient name because it encompasses everything. She hugged him. He held on. "Call me from Portland," he said into the top of her head. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. She was, he thought for the 100th time, a considerably braver person than most adults he'd met. She got in the car with Franklin. The door closed. Mason watched the car move into traffic and stay visible for 30 seconds before the airport curve took it. He stood on the departures curb for a moment. Olivia stood beside him and said nothing, because she understood, in the way she'd been understanding things over the past 4 days, when nothing was the right thing. Then they went in for their flight. The plane lifted out of Seattle-Tacoma at 2:40 p.m. into a sky that was clear all the way to the horizon, the city spread below them in its water and bridge and green geography. The port visible for a moment before the climb took them above the cloud line. Mason looked out the window at it, the cranes on the waterfront, the container terminal, the channel of water between the city and the islands. The infrastructure of commerce, ordinary and enormous and entirely indifferent to what moved through it. He thought about WH4471A sitting in Auburn in the flat light of afternoon with its federal code and its Pacific Meridian Holdings ownership, and whatever was inside it that people had gone to considerable lengths to ensure stayed invisible. He thought about the boardroom in Chicago, which he had not seen and could not picture specifically, but which had a shape in his mind anyway. A large table, a lot of expensive chairs, and a man sitting at the end of it who had spent 4 days building a story about an absent, unstable CEO. He thought about what that man would look like when the door opened. Olivia was reading the notebook beside him, going through the analysis one more time with a pen, making small marks in the margins, preparing. She did not look anxious. She looked like someone who had a problem to solve and was solving it, which was, he had come to understand, simply how she functioned under pressure. Not the absence of pressure, but the redirection of it. He opened his laptop and kept working on the spreadsheet. They flew east into the afternoon, and below them the country unrolled in its enormous flatness, ordinary and continuous, and somewhere in it an old piece of paper in a filing box in a storage unit was waiting to be found, though neither of them knew that yet. That would come later, in Chicago, in the hour before everything changed for the last time. The Commerce Department's Office of Inspector General occupied the 14th floor of a federal building in downtown Chicago that had the particular institutional gravity of places where consequential things happened without any architectural effort to signal it. The walls were the color of old paper. The carpet was gray. The fluorescent lighting was the kind that made everyone look slightly unwell. Mason had been in similar buildings during his Navy years. The kind of spaces that existed purely as containers for the work done inside them, stripped of everything that wasn't functional. They arrived at 6:40 p.m., having come directly from O'Hare with Olivia's carry-on and Mason's laptop bag and the USB drive that had not left Mason's jacket pocket since Denny's shop. Diane Farrell met them in the lobby, a compact woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair cut short and the organized efficiency of someone who had been doing serious legal work for long enough that she'd stopped performing seriousness and just embodied it. She shook Olivia's hand, then Mason's, and looked at him with the direct assessment of someone deciding whether he was going to be useful or complicated. "You built the routing analysis," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "You pulled the terminal records on a lapsed contractor credential." "Technically valid," he said. "Not deactivated." She looked at him for another half second. "Fine," she said. "Don't lead with that in there." She turned and walked toward the elevators, and they followed. The OIG contact was a man named Hargrove, deputy director, 50s, the kind of steady that came from 2 decades of watching financial crimes unfold with the slow inevitability of geology. He had 2 analysts with him and a conference table covered in folders that suggested this was not, as Olivia had told Mason on the plane, a cold start for them. Pacific Meridian Holdings had a file. It was thick. Hargrove shook their hands and got directly to it, which Mason appreciated. "Miss Sterling, we've been watching Pacific Meridian for 14 months. We had the shell structure, we had the Auburn facility flagged, and we had strong suspicion of a port corridor operation. What we did not have was the internal logistics network connection." He looked at her. "You're telling us it runs through Sterling?" "Through a falsified layer inside Sterling's routing system, yes," she said. 219 confirmed instances over 30 months. The routing analysis is here." She nodded to Mason. Mason opened his laptop. He had reorganized the spreadsheet during the flight into a presentation structure. Clean columns, the timestamp discrepancies highlighted, the frequency analysis by month showing the correlation with Sterling's internal operational focus periods, the container ID trail from the Sterling manifest to the federal scan at WH4471A to the exit from the tracking system. He had built it the same way he built maintenance reports, sequentially,
without editorializing, each conclusion following directly from the data that supported it. He walked them through it. He did not rush. He answered questions as they came, and Hargrove's analysts asked good ones, technical, specific, the kind that came from people who understood logistics infrastructure and were checking his work as he presented it. He answered all of them without qualification because the data held up to the questions. It held up because it was real, and because he had built the analysis correctly, and because 219 impossible timestamps were what they were, regardless of who was asking about them. At one point, one of the analysts leaned forward. "The export from the Federal Terminal database. How did you access the full records layer?" Mason looked at the analyst. He looked at Diane Farrell, who gave him a microscopic nod that meant exactly what he thought it meant. "Contractor credential," he said. "Previously issued by the Port Authority for maintenance contract work. The credential had not been formally deactivated." He paused. "The access was logged under my credential ID. The log will show the timestamp and the records pulled. I'm not asking you to take my word for what the data shows. I'm asking you to pull the same records through your own access, using your own credentials, and verify that they match what I'm presenting." Hargrove looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had just had his objection preemptively addressed. "That's what we'll do," he said. "The data will be the same," Mason said, "because it's the terminal records, not my interpretation of them, the records themselves." Hargrove looked at Olivia. "The internal access, whoever falsified these manifests had administrative routing credentials." "Yes," Olivia said. "The list of personnel with that access level is 15 people. I have reason to believe the primary internal actor is my chief operating officer, Richard Calloway." She laid it out: the access level, the operational calendar correlation, the March window, the Harmon and Briggs connection, the Pacific Rim contract recommendation that had created the distraction period for the heaviest use of the scheme. She presented it with the same precision she'd used when she was explaining the board situation to Margaret Chu. Organized, direct, without inflating the certainty she had, and without underselling what she actually knew. Hargrove listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the file in front of him, the 14-month-old file on Pacific Meridian Holdings, and he opened it and turned to a section near the back. "Harmon and Briggs," he said. "We have them in this file. Not as the registered agent for Pacific Meridian specifically, that's new for us, thank you, but as the counsel of record in 2 other shell company formations that we've connected to the same beneficial ownership structure." He looked up. "We believe the beneficial owner is a man named Terrence Volk. He runs what presents publicly as a private equity firm based in the Cayman Islands. In practice, we believe he operates a criminal logistics brokerage, selling access to legitimate shipping networks to organizations that need to move cargo without federal scrutiny." The room was quiet for a moment. "He recruited your COO," Hargrove said to Olivia. It wasn't a question either. "That's my belief," she said. "I don't have direct evidence of the recruitment, but the timeline and the Harmon and Briggs connection." "We have the direct evidence," Hargrove said. He turned more pages in the file. "Phone records from 14 months ago. We had Volk's secondary communication line under surveillance. There are 47 calls between that line and a number registered to a shell that we hadn't identified the human being behind." He looked at Mason's spreadsheet on the laptop screen. "Given what you've just brought me, I think we can identify that human being now." Diane Farrell spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "What's your timeline for moving on this?" "Tomorrow morning," Hargrove said. "We'll have our own analysts verify the terminal records tonight. If they match, and I believe they will, we move on the Auburn facility at first light, and we have federal marshals at Sterling Logistics headquarters before the market opens." Olivia was very still. "Before the board session," she said. "The board session is at 9 a.m., Hargrove said. "Originally, Margaret Chu has it delayed 48 hours under the company charter. We'll be at the building before 9 regardless," he said. "Whatever the session status?" He looked at her directly. "Ms. Sterling, I want to be clear about something. The action tomorrow is a federal law enforcement operation. It is not a corporate governance intervention. The board session and the question of company leadership is your business. What happens at WH4471A
and at Sterling's Network Operations Center tomorrow morning is ours. I understand, she said. You'll need to be available to us, you and Mr. Brooks, for the duration of the investigation. That will take weeks, possibly months. Testimony, documentation, verification of the analysis. We understand, she said. She glanced at Mason. He nodded once. Hargrove closed the file. He looked at both of them across the table with the measured assessment of someone making a final judgment call. You've done good work, he said. It came out without ceremony, just the plain evaluation of a professional. Both of you. This would have taken us considerably longer without the Sterling internal angle. They left the federal building at 9:15 p.m. The Chicago night was cold, a different cold than Seattle, drier, the wind coming off the lake with a directness that Seattle's maritime air didn't have. They stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, and the city moved around them in its enormous, indifferent evening. Well, Olivia said. Yeah, Mason said. She looked at the street. He looked at the street. They stood there being two people who had just handed over 4,312 records to a deputy director of a federal investigative office, and the specific deflation that follows the sustained effort of building towards something, when the building is done and the next thing hasn't started yet, settled over them both. I need to call Margaret, she said. Call Emma first, he said. She looked at him. Then she handed him his own phone. He called Emma. Emma answered on the first ring and immediately reported that Margaret Chu had a dog named Patterson, who was very large and extremely friendly, that Portland looked different from Seattle but had some of the same smells, and that Franklin the rabbit had been given a place of honor on the guest room pillow. She asked if everything was okay. He said yes. She said good. She asked to talk to Olivia. He handed the phone over without comment. He watched Olivia talk to his daughter in the cold Chicago night. He watched Emma apparently ask her something specific because Olivia's expression shifted into that particular unguarded register that appeared when she wasn't managing anything, just responding. She laughed once, a real one, not a social laugh, shorter and more surprised, and said something that made whatever Emma had said into a complete exchange, and then she said goodnight and handed the phone back. What did she ask you? He said. She asked if the thing that wasn't just getting robbed was fixed. What did you tell her? I told her almost, she said. Because it's true. They walked to the hotel Diane Farrell had arranged. Adjacent, practical, the kind with a lobby that was functional without being interesting. Olivia had a room booked under a name that wasn't hers, which Diane had arranged, and Mason had the room beside it because Diane had also, with no commentary, booked him a room, which he chose to interpret as professional thoroughness rather than Diane Farrell's assessment of the situation between them. He did not examine what he meant by that. He ordered room service, something hot, something with protein, ate it at the small desk while he went over the spreadsheet one more time, the way he always went over completed work, looking for what he'd missed. He didn't find anything. The analysis was solid. He'd known it was solid at Denny's table at 11:30 p.m. the night before, and a day in a Chicago flight hadn't changed that. He called Emma one more time before he slept. She was already in bed, Patterson apparently having relocated to the foot of the guest room bed in defiance of presumably some household rule that Margaret Chu had either rescinded or was pretending not to notice. Emma's voice had the softened quality of someone who was about to fall asleep and was making good use of the last few minutes of consciousness. Daddy, she said. Yeah. I think Olivia is going to be okay. He looked at the hotel ceiling. Yeah, Bug. I think so too. I think you're going to be okay too. He was quiet for a moment. Get some sleep. I'm already almost asleep. I know. Good night. Good night, Daddy. He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he slept. The next morning came in gray and fast. His phone buzzed at 6 a.m. with a text from Diane Farrell that said simply, "Moving at 7. Be ready." He dressed, drank the room's bad coffee standing at the window looking at the Chicago skyline, doing its particular gray morning thing with the lake just visible between the buildings, and knocked on Olivia's door at 6:30. She opened it immediately. She was already dressed. She looked like someone who had not slept much but had used the time productively, which was consistent with everything he knew about her. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. And then, because this was Olivia Sterling and she didn't practice unnecessary pretense, I'm nervous. Yeah, he said. That's appropriate. Is it? You're about to walk back into your own company after a week away with federal investigators simultaneously moving on a facility connected to your COO's criminal operation to face a board that's been told you've gone unstable and present evidence that will likely result in the arrest of someone you've worked with for 7 years. He paused. Being nervous about that isn't a character flaw. It's an accurate reading of the situation. She looked at him. You're very strange, she said again, but differently than the first time she'd said it. The first time had been at Denny's table with the eggs. This time it was something else. Not bewilderment exactly. More like recognition. I've heard that, he said. They rode to Sterling Logistics headquarters in Diane's car. The building was in River North, a clean tower of glass and steel that reflected the gray morning sky back at itself without any apparent editorial comment. The Sterling logo was on the building in tasteful silver letters that managed to be large enough to be authoritative without being large enough to be ostentatious. Mason looked at it through the car window and thought about Olivia saying, I built that company in the parking lot behind the Port Authority office. The particular nakedness of those 4 words. He thought about a 3-person operation in a Chicago warehouse when she was 24 years old. There were 2 federal vehicles already on the block when they arrived, unmarked, but identifiable to anyone who knew what to look for by the antenna configuration and the specific way they were parked. Hargrove had said, First Light. He'd meant it. Diane walked ahead of them into the lobby. The security desk staff recognized Olivia immediately. A young man behind the desk actually stood up, which Mason suspected was not standard protocol, but was also not performance. It was recognition. Whatever Richard Calloway had told people about the absent CEO, the people who worked in this building apparently had their own assessment. The elevator to the executive floor took 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, Olivia stood straight and forward-facing and said nothing, and Mason stood beside her and also said nothing, and Diane checked something on her phone with the focused calm of someone managing 3 simultaneous legal processes. The executive floor was already occupied. 3 members of the board were in the conference room visible through the glass wall. Margaret Chu, who caught Olivia's eye through the glass with an expression of absolute and uncomplicated relief, and 2 others Mason didn't recognize. Assistants moved through the space with the charged energy of a place where the normal gravity has shifted. Richard Calloway was not immediately visible. Then he was. He came out of a side office, a man in his late 40s, well-built, silver at the temples, wearing the particular kind of suit that said, I belong in every room I enter without looking like it was trying. He stopped when he saw Olivia. Something moved through his expression, a rapid, disciplined sequence that went through surprise and then something harder before settling into a version of professional composure that was entirely constructed. Olivia, he said, I'm glad we've all been worried. I'm sure you have been, she said. She said it pleasantly. The pleasantness was, Mason thought, the most frightening thing she could have said, because it was the pleasantness of someone who knew exactly where they stood and had nothing left to manage. Richard's eyes moved to Mason. He assessed him in the fast, reflexive way powerful men assessed other men, sizing up, categorizing, placing. Mason watched him do it and arrive at his conclusion. Nobody important. Delivery driver. Someone had apparently told the board. Working class. Not a threat. This is Mason Brooks, Olivia said. He's the person who built the routing analysis that the OIG is currently using to execute a warrant on your Auburn facility. The composed expression held for 1 more second. Then it broke. Not dramatically, not the way it broke in stories, not with a confession or a collapse. It broke the way structural failures actually happened, quietly and then completely, a small crack that became an absence. I don't know what you think you've found, he started. I know what I've found, Olivia said, and so does Deputy Director Hargrove. As if on cue, and it was not on cue, it was just the timing of events that had been set in motion 16 hours earlier. The elevator opened and 2 federal agents stepped out with Hargrove behind them, and Hargrove's expression was the expression of someone who had been doing this long enough that the procedural part of it was just a sequence of steps to execute correctly. What followed was not, in reality, the kind of scene that movies made of it. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic speech. Richard Calloway asked to speak to his attorney, which was his right, and the agents allowed it, and then the situation moved through its procedural stages with the grinding inevitability of legal mechanisms in motion. Mason stood against the far wall and watched it happen with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, observant, not detached, but understanding that his role in this particular sequence was already complete. He had built the analysis. The analysis had done what analyses do when they're correct. Everything after that was other people's work. Margaret Chu came out of the conference room and crossed to Olivia, and they had a conversation that lasted about 90 seconds and involved Margaret touching Olivia's arm once, briefly, with the directness of a woman who had known Olivia for a long time and had been worried in a specific way and was now, specifically, not worried anymore. Then Margaret looked at Mason. She crossed to him. "You're the warehouse worker," she said. "Marine mechanical engineer," he said. "Currently doing warehouse work." She looked at him with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who had been evaluating people for 40 years. "You pulled all of this together." Olivia knew where to look. "I knew how to read what we found." "That's generous." "It's accurate," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "What do you want?" she said. It was a direct question, asked directly, without apology. "Nothing," he said. "That's not an answer." "It is," he said. "I don't want anything from this. I helped because the problem was there, and I could see how to solve it." He paused. "I want Emma to be able to come home. That's what I want." Margaret Chu looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded, once with the gravity of someone who had just made a judgment and was comfortable with it. The board session happened that afternoon. Not the emergency session Richard had planned, but a different one, called by Margaret as lead independent director, with all 7 members present and Olivia at the head of the table where she belonged. Mason wasn't in the room for that. He waited in a small office down the hall that an assistant had offered him, with a coffee that was considerably better than the hotel's and his laptop open, not working on anything, just having something to look at. Diane came and found him at 3 p.m. "It's done," she said. "The board session?" "Unanimous confidence vote. They also voted to authorize an emergency executive powers clause that gives Olivia direct oversight of the operations division pending the investigation." She sat down across from him. "And Richard Calloway has been formally arrested. The Auburn facility was seized this morning. Hargrove says the initial inventory suggests the operation was considerably larger than even the container analysis indicated." She paused. "There are going to be more arrests. Volk is apparently in the Cayman Islands, which creates jurisdictional complexity, but Hargrove says they've been building toward him for 14 months, and this is the piece that completes it." Mason sat with this information. He thought about the diesel engine in Denny's shop, about the way a system that had been running wrong looked once you found the fault, how obvious it seemed from the outside, how invisible it had been from inside the routine. "What happens now?" he said. "Now you go home," Diane said, "and you come back when they need your testimony, which they will, probably in 4 to 6 weeks. She looked at him. "You should know that what you did, the terminal records access, is going to be reviewed by the OIG's own legal team. My professional assessment is that given the credentials' technical validity and the fact that you've been completely transparent about it, and it led to a significant federal investigation, you're not looking at any legal exposure. But I want you to have that information clearly." "I appreciate that," he said. "Olivia asked me to tell you she'd like to see you before you leave for the airport." He found her on the executive floor, in her own office, a large corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the city, the lake visible in the distance, the afternoon light doing something silver and specific on the water. She was standing at the window when he came in, and she turned when she heard him. The office was impeccably organized, clean lines, good furniture, nothing decorative except one photograph on the desk, too small for him to see clearly from where he stood, and a scale model of what appeared to be one of Sterling's cargo vessels on the credenza behind the desk. It was the office of someone who worked in a space without needing it to perform anything about them.
How did it go in there, Sam? He said. The way it should have, she said. Margaret held the original board members. The others, once Hargrove's team confirmed the warrant and the charges, the political calculation changed. She paused. People who were hedging their bets this morning were suddenly very interested in being on the right side. That's how it works, he said. Yes. She turned from the window. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the parking lot behind the Port Authority office, in the Chicago night outside the Federal Building, the direct, unmanaged version without the professional layer. I owe you an accounting, she said. You don't. Mason. The flights and the coffee and the sofa and whatever else, he said. Sort it out when it makes sense. I'm not in a hurry. That's not what I mean, she said. He was quiet. She crossed to the desk and sat on the edge of it. Not behind it, on the edge of it, which he registered as intentional. You stopped at a bus stop in the rain for someone you didn't know, she said. And then you just kept going. Every time the thing in front of you got more complicated, you just kept going. Not because you wanted anything, not because you were trying to be heroic, because it was the problem in front of you and you don't leave problems half solved. She paused. I have never met anyone like that. Emma does it too, he said. She just does it with math worksheets. Olivia looked at him for a moment. I want to offer you a position, she said, at Sterling. He'd thought this might come. No, he said. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. I appreciate it, and the answer is no. Because you don't want to work for me. Because I pick Emma up from school at 3:15, he said. And I'm not interested in a job that changes that. He paused. And because you'd be offering it for the wrong reasons. Because you feel like you owe me something and you want to solve that with a job. That's not why you hire someone. She looked at him steadily. He could see that she knew he was right about this and that it was slightly annoying to her. Advisory work, she said. Occasional, on logistics, infrastructure, and port operations, on your schedule. He thought about it. That was different. That was useful rather than compensatory. Maybe, he said, ask me again when the investigation settles down and you can think clearly about what you actually need. I already know what I need, she said, but she let it go. He looked at the photograph on the desk. From this angle, he could see it more clearly. A younger version of Olivia, maybe 25, standing in front of a building that looked like a warehouse, squinting against sunlight, wearing a hard hat that was slightly too large. She was smiling. It was a specific kind of smile. The smile of someone who was tired and excited in equal measure and hadn't yet learned how to separate the two. Is that the warehouse in Chicago? He asked. She turned to look at it. Year 2. Margaret insisted I get a hard hat for the photo because it was a construction site. I didn't own a hard hat. I borrowed one from a contractor. It didn't fit. You kept it, he said. Not the hat. The photograph. Some things you don't move, she said. He understood that. He thought about Emma's nightlight projecting stars on the ceiling, his late wife's old gift still plugged in and running. He thought about the engineering manual he'd been carrying between rooms for a week. Some things you don't move because moving them changes what they mean, and what they mean is the point. His flight was at 6. He left the building at 4:30 with his laptop bag and the USB drive that Hargrove's team had imaged and returned to him. And he took a cab to O'Hare in the gray Chicago afternoon and sat at the gate with a bottle of water and called Emma. Emma reported that Patterson the dog had slept on her feet during the night and that she was in favor of this development. She asked if she could come home. He said tomorrow. She said okay. She asked if everything was really fixed. He thought about 219 timestamps, about Richard Calloway's expression in the executive lobby when the composed version of his face had run out of composition to give, about Hargrove saying you've done good work without ceremony, just the plain fact of it, about Olivia standing in the parking lot behind the Port Authority office saying, I built that company, and the grief in those 4 words that was also a kind of pride, that was also simply the truth. Yeah, he told Emma. Everything's fixed. Good, she said. I want to come home. I know, Bug. Tomorrow. He flew back to Seattle alone.
The city came up beneath him in the descent the same way it always did. Water and bridges and the particular green of it even in winter, the port lights already running in the early dark. He looked at it the way you look at a place that is yours, not because you were born there, but because you built your life inside it, one decision at a time. And this particular decision had started with stopping a car at a bus stop in the rain. He thought about that, about the randomness of it, the specific rain of that specific night, the specific exhaustion of that specific day, the way he almost hadn't seen her until she was almost behind him. He thought about the version of himself that had kept driving. That version was driving home right now to a quiet apartment and a routine that would have continued exactly as it had been, functional and adequate, and missing something he hadn't known was missing. He thought that wasn't a productive direction to think in, and he stopped. He picked Emma up from Margaret Chu's Portland contact the next morning. Margaret had arranged a car to bring her back rather than a plane, a 5-hour drive that Emma apparently used to make friends with the driver, and arrive with complete knowledge of the driver's family situation and a strong opinion about the names the driver's sister should consider for her upcoming baby. He collected her from the lobby of the building where the car had dropped her with Franklin under her arm and her bag dragging behind her, and she put her arms around him in the middle of the lobby without caring about the people around them. He held on. "Ready to go home?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I missed the nightlight." "I know." They drove home in the ordinary morning, through the ordinary traffic, back to Clement Street and the elevator that worked 70% of the time, and the light above 4C that buzzed when you walked past it. And Mason unlocked the door and the apartment smelled like coffee, and the faint particular smell of their life in it, and Emma went immediately to her room to restore Franklin to his proper position. And Mason stood in the kitchen and made coffee and stood there with both hands around the mug for a moment. He looked at the kitchen table, at the place where Olivia had sat with the notebook and the manifest page, at the 4 chairs, 3 in their proper places and 1 in the corner of Emma's room holding stuffed animals, where it had been for 2 years. He thought about moving it back. He thought he might. Not yet, but maybe. 3 weeks later, the investigation had done what large federal investigations do. Expanded in scope, complexity, and paperwork, pulling in departments and jurisdictions, and requiring a volume of documentation that Mason spent several evenings on at the kitchen table after Emma was in bed. Terrence Volk was arrested at a private residence in Miami, which was not the Cayman Islands but turned out to be where he actually lived, and the jurisdictional complexity Diane had mentioned resolved itself with the efficiency that followed when someone had been building toward an arrest for 14 months, and the last piece finally fell into place. The Auburn facility yielded, in Hargrove's dry official language, a significant quantity of undeclared cargo that was being processed by multiple federal agencies, the specifics of which were sealed pending trial. Richard Calloway pled not guilty, which was expected, and his defense team made exactly the argument that Olivia had predicted, that the terminal records had been improperly accessed, that the methodology was flawed, that the manifest discrepancies were attributable to known system errors in the Sterling routing software. The OIG's own analysts had verified every timestamp independently within 48 hours of receiving the data. The argument went nowhere. It generated a week of legal filings and cost someone's defense fund a considerable amount of money and changed nothing about the underlying arithmetic, which remained 219 impossible container locations that could not be in 2 places simultaneously no matter what the filing said. Mason testified in a preliminary hearing on a Thursday morning. He wore the one good shirt he owned that wasn't a work shirt, a dark blue button-down that Emma had once told him made him look like a person who went to meetings, which she had meant as a compliment. He testified for 2 hours and answered every question the way he answered everything, plainly, sequentially, without elaborating beyond what the question required. The defense attorney asked him about the contractor credential access, and he explained it the same way he'd explained it to Hargrove and to Diane's invisible nod in the federal conference room. And the credential's technical validity had been reviewed by the OIG legal team and confirmed exactly as Diane had predicted, and the defense attorney moved on. Olivia testified the following day. He saw her briefly in the hallway outside the hearing room, and she looked like she'd slept and eaten properly, which was a change from the version of her he'd known in Denny's shop at midnight. "How's Emma?" she said. "Good. She wants to know if Patterson the dog is doing well." "I'll ask Margaret."
A pause.
She calls him Patterson like she's known him for years. She calls everyone like she's known them for years, he said. She called Denny Mr. Denny within about 45 seconds of meeting him. Olivia smiled. The real one. The one that wasn't managed. The one that arrived without announcement and stayed briefly and meant it. He'd seen it a handful of times now, and it was always slightly startling, the way genuinely good things are when you've been watching something suppress them. The advisory work, she said. Still too soon, he said. 3 months, she said. Ask me then, he said, and I might say yes. She nodded. They went their separate ways into their separate hearing rooms. He drove home that evening through Seattle in the late afternoon. The city doing its specific amber thing with the low light, the water visible in the gaps between buildings. He picked Emma up from Mrs. Callahan's and they drove home, and he made pasta, the real kind with vegetables, the way Olivia had made it that first evening. And Emma sat across from him at the table with the fourth chair still in the corner, but closer to the table than it had been. And they ate dinner and talked about the math worksheet situation, and a development with Priya that had apparently been resolved in Emma's favor, and a book Mrs. Callahan had given her that had a dog in it that reminded her of Patterson. He cleaned up the kitchen while Emma did homework at the table. He washed the dishes by hand the way he always did because the dishwasher had broken 6 months ago and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. He thought about the advisory work offer. He thought about the manifests. He thought about the cold night at the bus stop and the way a stopped car had turned into a booth at Patty's Diner had turned into a sofa, with stars on the blanket had turned into Denny's shop, and the federal building in Chicago, and a hearing room in the Dirksen courthouse. He thought about the things you don't know you're walking into until you're already inside them, and whether knowing in advance would change the decision. He thought about the version of himself that had kept driving, and he thought that version of himself had missed something. Not the investigation, not the federal testimony. Something simpler than that. The specific quality of sitting at a kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a manifest and a person who was trying to fix something broken and needed someone who knew how to read the fault lines. The particular aliveness of being part of something that mattered, with someone who was honest about why it mattered. He didn't have a clean, resolved feeling about any of it. His back still hurt from the warehouse work. The bill on the counter was paid, but there was a new one behind it. He'd missed 2 shifts during the Chicago trip, and the supervisor had been understanding in the technically understanding but not actually way that meant it was logged. Emma still had a gap where her front left tooth had been, and her teacher had noted on a recent paper that her math computation was improving, but she still rushed the showing her work section, which Mason suspected would be a personality trait rather than a phase. Everything was, in the practical ways, essentially the same as it had been. Except for the fourth chair, which was 2 feet closer to the table than it had been a month ago. A distance he had covered without deciding to, just moving it back incrementally over several evenings. The way you do with things you're not ready to make a decision about, but your hands have already made up their minds. Emma looked at it one evening and didn't say anything about it, which was unusual for Emma, and he thought maybe she understood something about it that he hadn't gotten around to saying out loud yet. Some months later, on a Saturday evening that had come in gray and turned clear, the way Seattle evenings sometimes did when the weather couldn't decide, there was a knock at the apartment door. Mason was at the kitchen table with the engineering manual, which he had finally returned to and was making actual progress through the hydraulics chapter. Emma was doing something in her room that involved a moderate amount of what he recognized as the sound of crayon on paper. He opened the door. Olivia was standing in the hallway. She was not in a car with security. She was not in a suit or a corporate context. She was in a coat he hadn't seen before, a practical one this time, dark gray and actually waterproof. And she had her hands in her pockets and her hair loose, and she was carrying in the crook of one arm a paper bag from a grocery store. He looked at the bag. "I thought I'd make dinner," she said. "If that's all right." He looked at her. He thought about the bus stop in the rain. He thought about the soup at Patty's. He thought about the fourth chair, 2 feet closer to the table than it had been. "Emma," he called, without looking away from the doorway. "Set the table." "How many places?" Emma called back. "3," he said. He stepped back from the door. Olivia came in out of the hall. The door closed behind her. And in the small, warm apartment on Clement Street,
With the light above 4C buzzing gently in the hallway outside and the sound of a 7-year-old getting out plates with the practical confidence of someone who had been expecting this, the evening began. Not because it was perfect, not because all the broken things had been mended and all the difficult things had resolved themselves into something comfortable,
but because one person had stopped at a bus stop in the rain without knowing why, and that had turned out to be enough. Not to fix everything, but to begin the specific work of building something worth keeping, one ordinary evening at a time.